the twilight's last gleaming, ooh, stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets ran black, the bombs burst in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the
All right, so that was the Star Spangled Banner. With me today is James Vaughn. This is a special Diet Soap Sublation Media video and podcast. James Vaughn is a professor in the social sciences at the University of Chicago. He is the author of the essay, The Revolution for Society, Rethinking Popular Sovereignty, American Independence, and the Age of the Democratic Revolution. And today he's joining me to help create a response video to Andrew Rakich's The Real Cause of the Revolutionary War from his channel, Atun-Shei Films. James, thanks for coming on to the podcast on short notice.
Thanks for having me, Doug. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, Clint, the administrator and I guess now COO of Sublation Media, spotted this video, thought it was an emergency situation. We had to make a response to it right away in the name of spreading the ideology of socialism in response to whatever this ideology is. And I have a bunch of clips from this YouTuber Andrew's video. I thought we'd walk through it and let you respond to it. But what was your impression of Andrew's take about the American Revolution overall?
Overall, I appreciated the fact that he wanted to put the origins and progress in the American Revolution in the context of a much larger world historical development. What I'll simply call the rise and evolution of bourgeois society in the early modern era. Nevertheless, I was disappointed by the class determinism and economic reductionism that he introduced in telling that story. Whether or not he's aware of it, it's a kind of classic Stalinist historiography that his argument is reflecting a kind of classic Stalinist historiography that developed in the 20th century that tended to reduce the emergence and evolution of bourgeois society to the question of the rise of a new class, principally a merchant class. But I'm probably getting already too much into the details. So I both appreciated his goal of setting the story of the American Revolution in a much larger world historical context, but I thought he was reductionist in both class and economic terms in doing so.
Okay, well, why don't we run the first clip? But I am curious to know, as we go through this, how this particular version of the history of the American Revolution served a Stalinist agenda, or how that emerged from Stalinism. So maybe that will come up as we move our way through it. I'll show you the first clip here. It's about 5 minutes or so long, and this is fair use because we are commenting on another YouTuber's content and adding critical commentary to it. So here we go.
So you may have heard about how in the early 17th century, Puritan separatists in England and the Netherlands had reached an ideological impasse with King James I and the Anglican Church. Life in the Old World was becoming spiritually intolerable. And besides, God wanted his true saints to spread knowledge of Christ to the darkest, most demonic corner of the world, the Metro West area of Boston, and there establish a new Jerusalem whose shining example would become a kind of metaphysical apocalypse bunker for the imminent end of days. All that is certainly true, but what often goes unremarked upon are the economic factors that underlied this revolutionary act. Puritan immigrants to New England were almost exclusively commoners. And crucially, most were part of a rising middle class of yeoman farmers, artisans, and guild merchants, whose wealth and productivity was beginning to challenge, even eclipse, that of the landed feudal nobility. Since the vast majority of international commerce centered in cities, the merchant class had begun in the Middle Ages as an urban phenomenon in places like the Italian city-states. It's no accident that the republics of Venice and Genoa were established by merchants. In places where the merchant class gained ascendance over the nobility, Republican government was almost always sure to follow. But by the 17th century, the fruits and opportunities of global colonization had expanded the mercantile middle class out of the cities and into virtually every aspect of European life. However, this middle class still retained a vestigial remnant of their origins in their name. Burgesses in English, Bürger in German, Borgesia in Italian, and bourgeoisie in French. That prefix burg, which pops up in English too, as in Pittsburgh, usually means town or fort or castle, and bourgeoisie literally translates to town dwellers. But the old feudal order wasn't going down without a fight. As the Burgesses amassed huge fortunes and all the influence that came with them, kings across Europe consolidated their power under this hot new philosophy called absolutism. In England, King James, and especially his son King Charles, became unprecedentedly despotic and encouraged an exclusionary culture among the nobility, drawing hard social lines between the God-chosen people with the magic blood and the tacky, nouveau riche upstarts of the merchant class. And as England became more and more inhospitable for the Burgesses in the 1620s and 30s, many of them decided to pull up stakes and head across the ocean to North America. Among them were some of the most legendary names in New England history. John Winthrop, the founder of Massachusetts, was the grandson of a master of the clothworkers, one of London's biggest craft guilds. Likewise, Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, came from a middle-class merchant family. His father was also a member of one of the top London guilds. And despite the Plymouth Pilgrims' well-recorded distaste for, in Edward Winslow's words, the vain expectation of profit, the Mayflower expedition was financed by wealthy merchant adventurers under a corporate charter. That's not to say that Puritan religion and all the anti-authoritarianism that came along with it was insincere or somehow a cynical cover for the settlers' crude economic interest. When your elementary school history teacher told you something vague and oversimplified about how early settlers came over for more opportunity and a better life, she wasn't entirely wrong. The merchant class was facing genuine persecution in England, both religiously and economically, and many rank-and-file Puritan immigrants correctly recognized that the colonies were a path toward upward mobility. Many of England's feudal tenants and small-time landowners became New England's magisterial, mercantile, and clerical elite. Who on earth can blame them for wanting to get out from under the thumb of outdated, arbitrary tyranny and improve their situation in life? My point is that when we cut through all the mythologizing about Plymouth Rock and turkey dinners and pumpkin pie, we find that there's a material root to this ideology of religious freedom that we've been told so much about. The Puritan push for a more democratized religious and political system in England stemmed from their frustration as a class, that despite their growing wealth and influence, they continued to be excluded from the social prestige and civic power of the nobility. And when this simmering anxiety not only went unaddressed, but actively suppressed by absolutist politics, it finally exploded into violence with the English civil wars between king and parliament. But there was a problem. To paraphrase historian Neil Davidson, radical Puritanism was an excellent battering ram for destroying the fortifications of feudalism. It proved much less effective as scaffolding to construct a new liberal order. Now, don't get me wrong, and I'm sure my longtime subscribers are kind of sick of hearing about this, but something they don't really teach us in American schools is that Puritanism was the wellspring of some of our most foundational ideas about liberalism. I mean, universal male suffrage, republican government, consent of the governed, all of that stuff was originally their idea, at least in the English-speaking world.
But what did you make of that opening clip there, James?
I think that clip basically contains everything I was talking about before we played it. That is to say, I both appreciate the attempt to tell a story about the colonization and settlement and development of the colonies of British North America in a much wider world historical context. But I think nevertheless that he's reductionist in his approach to it. If I can give a few examples, he basically characterizes the Puritan emigration to what was for Europeans the New World, to the East Coast of North America, as a kind of expression of growing political and social tensions within Western Europe, within the British Isles themselves. And I think that that's true, but not quite in the way he characterizes it. He basically wants to see the Puritans as bound up with the rise of a new or an emerging or ascending merchant class who experience the world of a still feudal England as sort of fetters on their productivity, their aspirations, their goals. And I think that's a classic Stalinist narrative. That is to say, you have a rising merchant class, or more broadly speaking, a rising bourgeois class, bourgeoisie, and they basically develop new markets, new implements, techniques of production, etc., within the within the kind of womb of the old feudal order. But eventually they come up against the limits of that order. He basically characterizes the political system in 17th century England, the political system that was repressive towards the Puritans, as an expression of the feudal nobility. That Stuart absolutism, the Stuart monarchy, was essentially the royal expression of a declining feudal noble class. I think that's really the wrong way to characterize it. And obviously, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I'll try and give some indication of the broader picture I would paint, which is to say, there was indeed greater mercantile activity, more merchants, and expanding commercial class, but that was not really the driving force of the social change of this period. Rather, it was an expression, a manifestation of a much more profound transformation. By the end of the Middle Ages, Doug, we're talking here roughly the 14th and 15th centuries, the 1300s and the 1400s. Serfdom had collapsed on the western half of the European continent. If you were to basically look from the Elbe River west, more or less you could say across those parts of Europe, serfdom had collapsed. And with it, feudalism had collapsed. And essentially, unfree labor, the whole system that was at the core of feudalism, had given way. And what had taken its place by 1500 was free labor. That is to say that the people living in Western Europe, especially in Northwestern Europe and the British Isles, by the early 16th century, were still more or less living as they had been living at the end of the Middle Ages. But now they were no longer unfree laborers. They were no longer serfs or bondsmen. They were no longer born into conditions of direct domination, overt servitude. Rather, they were increasingly free laborers, and there had developed increasingly commercial farming in the countryside. Whether we're talking about, like in southeastern England, you had vast estates owned by aristocrats who had previously been feudal aristocrats, had now become commercial aristocrats, or we're talking about the territories that are today's Belgium or the Netherlands or northwestern France, in which there were peasants that basically had previously been serfs but had now become peasant proprietors. They had become the owners, the controllers, the proprietors of their own small plots of land. Basically, commercial farming had developed. And as a result, also what had happened was there was no longer going to be a limit on the growth of urban centers. That is to say, while it is true that there was the development of urban centers and an urban economy in Europe during the Middle Ages, the reason why there's continuing urbanization and commercialization in the western half of Europe following the Middle Ages, as opposed to in Eastern Europe, is because really unfree labor has come to an end and there is now free labor. And in a world of free labor, a world where social life is primarily mediated by the sale of labor and its products, where social life is no longer mediated by caste distinctions or overt hierarchies and forms of domination, there develops a freely or spontaneously determining division of labor in which people increasingly decide what kind of work to pursue, what kind of productions of goods and services to pursue in pursuit of their own interests, their own aims and ambitions. And so as a result, you can have increasing production exchange of commodities. Why am I emphasizing this, Doug? Because without this kind of massive development of free labor across Western Europe by 1500, you would not really have had the universalization of commodity production and exchange. And as a result of that, as a result of the development of commercial farming, a result of the increasing economic and social mobility of the population, a result of people being able to move within and among the countryside looking for work and gainful employment, ultimately into towns and cities and to further develop those towns and cities. And it's because of that that eventually you get some merchants and petty manufacturers who make the decisions that rather working within the old guild system in, say, Venice or in London or in Newcastle or in Antwerp, they can actually bring some of these free laborers together within a workshop or a manufacturing center or a commercial warehouse and kind of organizing them differently in the labor process, develop a kind of detailed division of labor as Adam Smith famously describes in his pin factory example in The Wealth of Nations. It's because of those developments, it's because that labor in its length and breadth has become free, has become in a sense a commodity, that you can have the universal production exchange of commodities. And that allows for a feudal society that is in crisis to become a bourgeois society, not a society in which the bourgeoisie dominate, but rather a society in which the relations between people, whether they're in the biggest cities like London and Paris and Amsterdam, or they're in small rural towns and villages, those relations have fundamentally become mediated by the free exchange of labor and its products. And as a result, a bourgeois society is developing across the length and breadth of Western Europe, not just in cities, but in the countryside as well. And that's really fundamentally important because that gives rise to the merchant class. The reason why there's more mercantile activity, there are more merchants, there's a greater merchant class in Western Europe, in the British Isles, by the 17th century when this gentleman is talking about the Puritan immigration, is because bourgeois society is developed. And I'll just conclude, I know I've gone on a link, Doug. There's no more feudal nobility in England. This is really important to stress. Feudalism in England is completely done and dusted no later than 1500, really no later than the beginning of the Tudor era, with the coming to the throne of Henry VII in 1485. And so I really have to stress the nobility that he's talking about being a feudal nobility frightened by this rising merchant class and so forth. It just does not exist. That is to say, there is a nobility, there are aristocrats with great titles and family names, and they have peerages, meaning they're born not only into their county seats, but seats in the House of Lords, the upper chamber of the British Parliament or the English Parliament. There are also lesser nobility, common nobility without titles, gentry, landed gentlemen. They exist. Do not get me wrong, they exist, and their land is an inheritance passed on to them by their ancestors. But nevertheless, their land has been thoroughly commercialized. They do not coercively wield control over a population of serfs, unfree laborers. Rather, what do these gentlemen and aristocrats do? They take portions of their land, or if they have smaller estates, their entire estate, and they rent it out to a tenant farmer. That tenant farmer then employs agrarian wage laborers, and basically that tenant farmer sells the cash crops they produce on the market competitively, entrepreneurially. They figure out how to work harder and smarter to make their labor force, their agrarian wage laborers, their animal husbandry, their crop rotation more efficient so they can produce more crops, sell them, and make more money, and therefore pay themselves a higher salary and also reinvest in production so they can improve their agricultural production. And over time, aristocrats and gentlemen in England, by the Puritan immigration, they are not living off of a coerced labor force. They're living off of rents determined by the market, contracts made with tenant farmers that rent a portion of their land to produce cash crops for sale on the market. And therefore, the English nobility is thoroughly commercialized or bourgeoisified. I know it's hard for us to imagine, but E.B. Thompson once said this in his essay, The Peculiarities of the English. It's hard for us to imagine, but those 17th century English landowners were as bourgeois as any merchant you can imagine. And why am I emphasizing this? Because the political conflicts that developed are not reducible to class terms. That is to say, there are members of the landed elite, the gentlemen and aristocrats, on both sides of the divide between the coming fight between Parliament and the Crown. There are members of the merchant class on both sides of the divide. There are incredibly successful members of the merchant adventurers, the Levant Company, the East India Company, all loyal to and supporting and backing the Crown, its absolutist project. So the point I'm trying to make here is that he did a great job of linking the Puritan immigration to a wider transformation of society in Western Europe and the British Isles, but then he reduced it to these extremely narrow class terms where something much wider is going on. It's really a glowing conflict between people who think there are new possibilities slumbering within this developing bourgeois society that need to be tapped by capturing political power and developing the state in different ways, and other people who believe there's a kind of degeneracy, a decline going on in society, and there needs to be a kind of control and limits placed on these developments. But maybe I haven't made myself clear enough, but hopefully that explains why I think he's being class reductionist.
I want to have I have a couple questions just to clarify in my own head. Kind of going to repeat what you said back to you in my own way, if I can. So it sounds to me like, while you in a sense agree with him that the Puritans set off for the New World seeking new opportunities on the basis of their bourgeois status and on the basis of their being merchants. But you disagree that what was acting as a fetter on them was the old feudal order, because that feudal order had already dissipated and the nobility had been bourgeoisified. They were as commercial as anyone at that point. And the people who stayed behind and supported the absolutist king and who were oppressing the Puritans were also merchants or bourgeois. Is that correct? So is that roughly right?
Yeah, I mean, the debate is over the possibilities, possible developments. It's not, you cannot really understand the political conflicts that express themselves in the English Civil War and the Revolution of the mid-17th century as between a rising merchant class and a declining feudal aristocracy.
So what the difference is that the Puritans had a different political vision within the bourgeois order. All right, they had a different ideological uh, direction they were going in within the bourgeois order. They saw other opportunities, and they were motivated to break free of fetters, but those fetters couldn't be simply defined as class interests alone. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And if I could just elaborate on that,
Mm-hmm.
who are the Puritans? I'm talking about in England.
Mm-hmm.
That term is initially a term of abuse, right? It's like the term queer, originally a term of abuse that then becomes a kind of positive category. But it was a term of their enemies. They were considered Puritans or puritanical. They considered the Church of England insufficiently Protestant, right? The Church of England had emerged from the Protestant Reformation, which in England was very much a top-down process. We need not get into the details, but essentially Henry VIII wanted a divorce. He could not get one. His cardinals and the Pope could not secure him a divorce for various geopolitical reasons. And as a result, he broke from Rome and essentially took the Church of England, that is the territorial Roman Catholic Church in the realm of England, the Kingdom of England, outside of the Roman Catholic Church. And he placed himself and the English crown supreme over that territorial Church of England. Now, what had happened is that church remained, by and large, Catholic. Henry VIII was actually quite theologically, religiously conservative. That is, he was a fairly committed Catholic. He just wanted to replace the Pope as the supreme head of the Roman Catholic Church in England with the crown, with himself as the supreme head. But over time, we need not get into the details. Essentially, he found that in order to adequately carry out this process and to break from Rome, he had to draw on Lutheran and eventually later Tudor monarchs, Calvinist ministers and clerics and writers who increasingly supported this process. So by the time of Queen Elizabeth, the Church of England was really, if you forgive me this crude way to characterize it, what's often called Diet Catholicism or Catholicism light. It was essentially in many of its rites, ritual structures, Catholic. It had episcopacy. It had bishoprics. It had stained glass windows. It had many rites and rituals of the Catholic Church. And therefore, for a lot of Lutherans and particularly Calvinist Protestants in England, it was insufficiently Protestant. It had insufficiently been purified of what they viewed as the anti-Christian or satanic remnants of the kind of old Catholic Church of England. So those people initially had remained within the church and tried to reform it within, but by the early 17th century, they increasingly separated themselves out into independent or separate congregations. They became Puritans, meaning they were not happy with the what they regarded as the not significantly enough purged Church of England, and they became Protestant nonconformist or dissenters. That is, they were not Catholics, they were Protestants, but they dissented from the Church of England. They refused to conform with it. Just to finish the point, those people, the people who were attracted to the Lutheran and Calvinist message, the message that one should basically read the Bible in one's own vulgar or vernacular language, that is not in medieval Latin, mediated by a priesthood, but on one's own in English or German or French or Swedish or Italian. Their belief is you read the Bible on one's own, that in that way your conscience has direct access to the voice of God. And then with other people, you decide how to form a church, a worshiping community, or what was traditionally known as an ecclesia. Ecclesia in original primitive Christianity in the Roman Empire, just meant people who got together to read sacred texts and worship collectively. And so they decided, essentially, the people who were influenced by the ideas of Luther and Calvin, that people should form ecclesias, churches, simply on their own to decide how to worship Christ, how to live together in the world as Christians. Now, just to conclude this point, the reason why that message was increasingly appealing had a great deal to do with the development of bourgeois society. That is to say, since the collapse of serfdom and feudalism in the late Middle Ages, in the 14th and 15th century, with the development of cities in Europe, cities that were no longer bound to the old feudal order, but had become unleashed from the feudal order and were increasingly being populated by free laborers looking for employment. Those cities became hubs of a new culture that we come to know, the Renaissance, right? A culture completely outside the confines and monopoly of the Roman Catholic Church. That new public sphere, that new public culture was forming in the developing towns and cities of the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the 16th century. And those people were becoming, a lot of people were becoming more literate and more cultured and participating in this associational, literary, developing public sphere, public culture of these towns and cities. And they were increasingly looking to read pamphlets and books and have discussions that were not monopolized by the Roman Catholic Church, that were not simply to do with traditional medieval concerns and values. And it's that world famously that Johannes Gutenberg, when he invents the printing press in Mainz in 1453, 1454, is trying to speak to. He knows that all over Western Europe, there are these new reading publics, principally in the towns and cities, that are desperate for manuscripts to be circulated. They want many new manuscripts covering many new aspects of social and economic life that the church doesn't cover or the Roman Catholic Church doesn't speak to. And therefore, he invents the printing press like many other goldsmiths and printers or publishers are looking for. They're looking for faster ways to produce manuscripts. And so the invention of the printing press is precisely to have a quicker way to produce literature, to produce books for this new reading public, this new public sphere of the post-Renaissance towns and cities of Western Europe. And those people increasingly are of a view that they want direct access to the Bible in their own languages. They are free people. They make contracts in daily life with other people. They're not bossed around by feudal nobility. They're not bossed around by merchant patricians. They're not bossed around by anybody. They're not bossed around by the Roman Catholic Church. The daily experience of their life is entering into free contractual business negotiations, meeting people in the market square, in the pubs, in the taverns, in the bazaars, discussing, debating, coming to their own opinions. They believe that they can, through their own conscience, should directly read the Bible in their own language and decide how to collectively worship together as a church. And this type of movement doesn't just initially develop as Protestantism. It develops within the Roman Catholic Church. The first people making these kinds of arguments, the first great representatives of these views, are the likes of Thomas More, one of the great intellectuals of Renaissance London, Erasmus, one of the great intellectuals of Renaissance Rotterdam, and eventually coming to the University of Cambridge in London. And they're making these kinds of arguments. And Luther and Calvin simply take these arguments in a more extreme direction to breaking with the church altogether. I'm saying this, Doug, because we have to think of the social world of early 17th century England. The person who becomes a Puritan, he's right. One can't deny it, that they are, by and large, yeoman farmers, merchants, more prosperous artisans and craftsmen, commercial farmers, landed gentry. And it's no question that they're identified broadly with the middling sort, right? They're not either the kind of upper aristocracy or the poor, but nevertheless, it's a social experience that speaks to them, right? That they have their own individual conscience by which they set the course of their existence. And they can therefore read the Bible in their own language and come freely together with other people and form ecclesia, communities of worship, to figure out how to worship Christ appropriately. So I'm trying to get at the fact that there's kind of a new experience of the world coming into being in early modern Western Europe. And this experience is really strongest in Northwestern Europe, including the British Isles, above all in England itself. And therefore, I think that one needs to think about the Puritans as not just simply a merchant class, but rather as the kind of, if you'll forgive me, the vanguard of a kind of thinking through the possibilities, the potentialities of this new social world coming to existence, of people freely setting the course of their own life individually, and then interacting with one another to create collectivities greater than the sum of its parts to collectively determine the course of their existence. And therefore, he's right to link Puritanism to liberalism. But liberalism is not reducible to Puritanism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and one thing that you just mentioned that I want to emphasize from my usual Hollywood-oriented point of view is that if you know the story of Thomas More from the 1966 movie A Man for All Seasons, in that movie, Thomas More represents the upright bourgeois character. And yet, it's the king who wants a divorce that ends up creating the church, which was a vehicle for more substantial changes to society. So you see this kind of impulse being multifaceted, having different sides to it, I guess.
Yes, that's correct. And that movie, which is a wonderful movie, A Man for All Seasons. I haven't seen it in years, but I forget who plays Thomas More.
Oh gosh,
a wonderful actor. And
let me find out who I should know. I want to say, well, no, it's not him. It's yeah. I'm going to just look it up here.
no, while you're looking up, Doug, that movie.
Paul Schofield.
Is that right? Paul Schofield.
Yeah.
He's wonderful, and he that movie, I forget who writes it, but More is presented very much as the kind of bourgeois figure. I had not read, I must confess, Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, but I watched, I think it was the BBC productions, and obviously it's really Cranmer that's being presented as the bourgeois figure, and More is the kind of symptom of a declining order. But we could get into that, but that's an earlier period. But what I'm really trying to stress here is that, the gentleman who presented in that said, what your elementary school teacher told you was not wholly wrong, right? That people went to the New World for opportunity and to build a better life for themselves. Listen, that is just really deeply true. Meaning, we now know, we've had a great deal of research across the later 20th and 21st century into emigration patterns from the British Isles to North America in the peopling and colonization and settlement of North America. And we just now know that the Puritans who settle New England are just one element amongst much, much wider settlements. That is to say, people leave the British Isles for the same reasons they moved within the British Isles. That is, by the 16th and 17th century, feudalism has completely collapsed in Northwestern Europe, in the British Isles. In England, there's a bourgeois society. People move throughout the countryside, Doug, looking for work in commercial farming. If they can't find it, they move to a nearby town. If they can't find it here, they try to go to a bigger provincial city. If they like Norfolk or Newcastle or Liverpool or Bristol. And ultimately, of course, the great kind of sucking vacuum of early modern England is London, where something like 1 out of 6 people spend a portion of their life eventually. And the point I'm trying to make is a lot of people who go to the Western port cities like Bristol, Liverpool, what have you, they end up deciding just to go across to the New World to look for work. Either they're middling sort families and they travel as nuclear families, they can pay for their own travel, or they're usually younger men in their 20s, kind of they finished their apprenticeship and now they're starting out as a craftsman or an artisan. They can't find work, so they decide that they'll be a bonded laborer, an indentured servant for someone for 5-10 years, what have you, to pay the cost of the transatlantic voyage. And then they'll either set up shop of their own or they'll move farther west and become a free farmer. The point I'm trying to say is the Puritan emigration, it's a kind of a very old literature to concentrate on the Puritan emigration. That is important, don't get me wrong, for all the reasons we've just talked about. But we now know that they're just one element and a small element in a much larger picture where people throughout the 17th and 18th centuries are leaving Western Europe and the British Isles in order to basically create a better life for themselves, search for opportunities in the New World, above all in British North America. That's a really dynamic magnet for people looking to improve themselves and to find opportunity.
All right, let's watch the next clip here, but this is great. So here we go. It's clip 2.
Revolutions are systems failures, and successful revolutions can't just overthrow the current system of power. They have to provide a viable alternative. In order to challenge the state, revolutionaries need to build extrajudicial, extra-statist power structures of their own, which can pick up where the old regime leaves off. As a decentralized, bottom-up social movement, Puritanism lacked the concrete power structures necessary to retain long-term rule after they overthrew and beheaded King Charles I. Hence, we had the so-called Commonwealth of England, 20 years of hard-handed Puritan military dictatorship before the restoration of King Charles II in 1660. But you know who did have concrete extra-statist power structures? The secular merchant guilds, who were less interested in morality than they were in enterprise. Their first principle was making money. The Puritans restructured the English state into a vehicle for bringing about the New Jerusalem, a fundamentally irrational goal that proved unsustainable. The merchants had a different vision, restructuring the state into a vehicle for facilitating commerce. And they had the organizational power to do it. So, after a brief but similarly disastrous return to absolutism with Charles II and James II, the secular burgesses finished the process that the Puritans had started with the decisive Glorious Revolution of 1688, which established stable parliamentary rule under a neutered monarchy, enshrined liberal legal principles in an English Bill of Rights, and forever cemented the primacy of a capitalist economy in the British Isles. The burgesses now had unquestioned cultural dominance, and were given carte blanche to pursue a policy of infinite economic growth as they plied the global market. It's no accident that the new monarch, William III, was from the Netherlands, the first truly capitalist country. The Dutch had separated church and state, by state read commerce, and encouraged freedom of expression and religion. Religious extremism, whether Catholic or Calvinist, was simply bad for business. Monarchies weren't necessarily a deal-breaker, as long as they weren't absolutist. Kings and queens could dress up in jewels and capes and prance around all they liked, just as long as they understood who was really in charge.
All right, so what do you make of that?
So he's talking broadly what could be called the Long English Revolution, meaning from the beginning of the civil wars that start in the early 1640s between Crown and Parliament, all the way through to the Glorious Revolution and its aftermath in the late 1680s and 1690s. That more or less 50-year period from the 1640s to 1690s is sometimes called the Long English Revolution. I think he's right to say that there's a great deal of millenarianism in the early English Revolution. That is, when we see the forces of Parliament eventually victorious over the Crown, that happens in the years 1648 and 1649. We then see a move not just to try and execute the then legitimate king, King Charles I. We also see a move to abolish monarchy altogether. And they create the Commonwealth of England, a republic. And England is a republic for 11 years, and it's the only 11 years in its entire history that England has been a republic. There's a great deal of millenarianism at the beginning of that process. There's no question. There's an idea of the rule of the saints. The saints will rule and prepare the millennium. But over time, what happens in the early phase of the English Revolution, I'm talking now the 1640s and the 1650s, the period of the Civil Wars and the Commonwealth from 1649 to 1653, and then the Protectorate, a quasi-military dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell. During that time, political power is used to essentially remove what were kind of feudal remnants. Now, I know I've said that feudalism doesn't really exist in England from the 16th century, but of course there are remnants and vestiges of a great deal of feudal power and feudal reserves, and political power is used to eliminate those things. And furthermore, political power is used to really untap a great deal of the potentials and possibilities of bourgeois society. I'll give you one example of this. By and large, prior to the 1640s and the 1650s, the English state had really only indirectly supported commercial and colonial development overseas by largely giving charters out to aristocratic proprietors and adventurers and merchants, and then letting them do what they wanted. But with the English Revolution, there's a real commitment by the new groups that have come to power to really systematically develop commercial and colonial overseas expansion. And the way you can see that is a number of things. First off, they try and make an alliance with the Dutch Republic in order to have open access to each other's colonies and markets. That doesn't work, and then they go to war with the Dutch Republic in order to try and pry open access to their markets and colonies. Then they create a naval industrial complex, meaning they decide in England under the kind of new regime, the Commonwealth or Republic, to systematically develop a navy. And they passed what are known as the Trade Navigation Acts to kind of systematically regulate their commercial and colonial expansion overseas. Why are they doing all of this, Doug? They're doing all of this because they've basically come to believe that commerce and manufacturing can only be further developed if they're able to really systematically expand overseas through maritime or seaborne commerce, through access to the markets of the world for trade, but also to develop colonies in areas either where there is no pre-existing population or there's a pre-existing population where people can be easily displaced, such as the eastern seaboard of North America, where indigenous communities are, relatively speaking, easily displaced. It's not like the Aztec or the Incan empires in Mexico and Peru, right? And so what happens during the English Civil Wars and English Revolution of the 1640s and 50s is the new parliamentary republic, the new parliamentary state, really systematically steps in to commit itself to permanent commercial and colonial overseas expansion. But this is a very different type of expansion, because what they think should happen is that the state should provide the public infrastructure for the free play of private interests. That is to say, they're developing this navy, but this navy is not meant to be predatory on English commercial activity. Rather, this navy is meant to protect English commercial activity. They're developing these laws of trade and navigation not to be predatory on English overseas expansion, but in order to further and stimulate English overseas expansion. So really what happens is there becomes a kind of hothouse. The state becomes a hothouse for the development of bourgeois society. There's even more mercantile activity after the 1640s and 1650s that there was before. There's even more manufacturing development, not only for domestic markets, but for overseas markets and to support overseas colonization than there was before. There's also an unleashing of the press, right? Press censorship is highly loosened. And the press is much more opened up. Many more books and pamphlets and periodicals are published during the English Revolution than before. There's much wider debate and discussion, all of that. And so what we see emerge, Doug, by the 1650s, by the time that essentially the English Revolution is coming to an end and the monarchy is going to be restored, what's going to happen essentially is the Convention Parliament in England is going to invite the eldest son of the executed King Charles I, Charles II, to come and take the throne. And what's developed principally amongst English radicals and revolutionaries is a sensibility that freedom is really in commercial society or bourgeois society. Now, it's not that these radicals are not religious, right? But they've really become advocates increasingly for religious toleration. That is to say, their view of the world, these radicals and revolutionaries that really will go on, by the way, to found during the Restoration in the 1670s and 1680s, they're going to found something called the Whig Party. And what their view essentially is, Doug, is that there really should be a free and open commercial society in which people individually set the course of their own existence and then freely associate, freely interact, freely discuss and debate with others in order to achieve ends that they can't achieve on their own, right? They become advocates for a maximally expansive civil society, a world of voluntary associations and businesses and enterprises and joint stock companies and conventions and reading associations, literary societies, where people can freely interact and discuss and debate. And their world, their views increasingly become that that a church, an ecclesia, should work just like any other voluntary association. This receives its most famous expression in John Locke's 1689, A Letter Concerning Toleration, where Locke famously says, a church and ecclesia, a community to worship together, a community to think together about not this life, but the next life, not the ephemeral world, but the eternal world. That is just like any other voluntary association. Locke says you should form a church just like you form an insurance company or a joint stock corporation or a reading society. Basically, you should come together freely. You should contract and cooperate. You should set up your own rules to live by and worship by. And if people decide that they can no longer worship in that way, that this is no longer the true path to salvation, they should be able to freely exit and pursue some other path to salvation. And so where I agree with the gentleman who is the presenter, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, is essentially that the Glorious Revolution is the ultimate victory of that kind of approach. That with the Glorious Revolution and the transformation of England/Great Britain in the wake of the Glorious Revolution, effectively a once absolute monarchy becomes a constitutional monarchy, not simply ruling of its own accord by divine right or indefeasible bloodline hierarchy, but rather ruling through parliament and the law, which means, I hope it's clear, is that the state is no longer above society, but is now subject to society. Mm-hmm. The society is not the subject of the state, but rather the state is subject to society, and the state must rule through society. So what happens after the Glorious Revolution, if I could put it crudely, Doug, is now the English state is constantly thinking about how to expand bourgeois and commercial society, how to develop it, how to create the public infrastructure for the greater free play of private interests. How do you should create turnpikes, you should dredge canals, you should improve harbors to allow more ships to come into them. You shall have postal service. You should make it easier for people to set up shops and coffee houses and businesses. And the idea of the state here is if you allow civil society, which is just, the world of voluntary association within a wider bourgeois or commercial society to freely develop on its own, you will eventually get much more revenue than you otherwise could simply by acting predatory or extractive with regard to that society. And that will allow you that revenue to provide internal law and order, external defense, and greater public infrastructure for the free play of private interests. So ultimately, I land where he lands, which is to say that the Glorious Revolution makes the English monarchy a constitutional monarchy ruling through parliament and the law. I would just stress, Doug, it's not a merchant class, though, overthrowing a feudal class, right? The same landed nobility that are basically giving advice and consent to Charles II and James II are in control. Their sons are the people sitting in the House of Commons after the Glorious Revolution, okay? Mm-hmm. What has really changed is that the monarchy has become subject to parliament and the law, which means the state now must rule through society. And the state becomes a handmaiden for the self-development, the self-expansion of bourgeois society. And that gets realized in all sorts of different ways, Doug. I'll just name a few of them. Okay. After the Glorious Revolution, before the Glorious Revolution, the Crown could basically dismiss Parliament more or less arbitrarily and call Parliament. After the Revolution, while the Crown can still convene and dismiss Parliament, there has to be a Parliament every 3 years. At least, right? Meaning there has to be a parliament. Now that will eventually be changed to every 7 years, but it means that parliament will have to sit ultimately permanently. Yes, the crown convenes and dismisses parliament, but there'll more or less be parliament sitting more or less the whole time. It will never go out of it will never basically go out of being convened. And there must be a new parliament called with elections held every initially 3 years and then later 7 years. Another index of that, in 1695, the Licensing Act is not renewed. What's the Licensing Act? The Licensing Act essentially allowed for pre-publication censorship. If you wanted to publish a book or a pamphlet, Doug, or a news magazine, you had to go to a royal licensor and get a stamp that approved it. They allowed the Licensing Act to pass, and so therefore, from 1695 to today, England become the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, has never had pre-publication censorship. Now, it has very strong post-publication libel, which is why the US today has greater free speech than the United Kingdom, because although the United Kingdom has the longest continuous regime of no pre-publication censorship, it has very strong post-publication libel laws. But again, that's an index of an expanding bourgeois society. Another great index of this is the fact that you can basically move freely. If you're there in 1700 in England, you can move pretty much freely within England, Scotland, and Wales, and you could even get on a ship in Bristol and Liverpool and go over to Virginia, or go over to Massachusetts, or go over to Maryland, so on and so forth. So that is ultimately, really, I would say, the British Isles, and above all England, above all London, become the epicenter of bourgeois society. But bourgeois society is really a world historical phenomenon. It is not a class phenomenon. It's a world historical phenomenon. And everybody in the world, increasingly from 1700, is involved in this world historical phenomenon that has its epicenter in Northwestern Europe, above all in London.
Yeah, we're going to need to come back to this question of class, I think, before we're done. But I just want to point out that in the clip we watched, he indicates that the state controlled by the merchant class was all about profits, money making. And in your telling, that isn't completely untrue, but it is that the society's productivity is encouraged through the state on many different levels with many different projects. And it wasn't a matter of simply making money for the Puritans as a class, but rather encouraging the development of a free society. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And that's why I tried to emphasize bourgeois society as opposed to the development of a bourgeois class. I mean, of course, there is a developing merchant class, but that's just a manifestation of a much greater transformation of social relations and its length and breadth, right? Mm-hmm. Let me just take the viewers, if I could, Doug, back to a classic point by Marx. This is made in volume 3 of Capital, right? There have been cities and merchants throughout all of recorded history. By recorded history, I mean, of course, the history of civilization, right? More or less since the development of a sophisticated and developed enough settled agriculture that some people could live off the land in towns and cities.
Egypt.
Sorry?
Say Sumner, Egypt. We're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. There's that old book, History Begins at Sumer, or whatever. I can't remember.
Right.
There's a great truth to that, right? Once settled agriculture is sophisticated enough, a small group of people can live off the land in non-agricultural events. That's the birth of culture, the arts, reading, writing, etc. Civilization. Okay, throughout civilization, there has been the development of an urban and commercial life. Towns, cities, merchants. Okay, that has existed. An area that I'm quite familiar with from my own historical research, the world of the Bay of Bengal in the 17th and 18th century, sort of northeastern India, a remarkable development of coastal ports like Calcutta itself eventually in the 18th century, but plenty of mercantile activity. The point is that, as Marx says in volume 3 of Capital, right, that mercantile activity could never access the length and breadth of life as a whole, right? Why? Because most people were unfree laborers, were bound to the land through a whole system of custom, of tradition, of hereditary status, of caste distinction. They were born into a particular place in life, lot in life, and they were tied to a particular land community to play out a certain social role, okay? And as a result, right, mercantile life, although it can become incredibly expansive, whether we're talking about Venice in the year 1100, or we're talking about Alexandria in the year 100, in the year 100 of the Common Era, you can have a great urban development and commercial development. But by and large, that happens in the interstices of society. That happens between societies, between different elites trading in luxury goods, right? What makes Western Europe so different in the early modern period is with the development of free labor. Everybody, right, is becoming involved in the production and exchange of commodities. That is to say that commodity production exchange, free labor and the exchange of its products comes to mediate life in its entire length and breadth. So what's driving European development is not a small group of relatively well-off consumers of luxury goods, aristocrats, urban patricians. Rather, increasingly, everybody has a bit more disposable income to purchase goods and services. Okay, you could have never gotten the kind of tobacco. By the 17th century, tobacco is the greatest commodity of world history, right? In terms of what is entailed in its production, the amount it's produced, the amount it's sold, etc. Okay, the reason for that is because you are servicing the entirety of society in Western Europe, right? You are not the kinds of developments that are going on, people going out, right? You have to think about what's happening in Western Europe during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. People are taking incredibly hazardous journeys around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, to get to Asian waters to buy cinnamon and spices and nutmeg and cotton and silk, muslins and chintzes and calicos and finer dyed textiles and lighter textiles. People have gone across the Atlantic to set up tobacco and rice and indigo colonies, initially worked by indentured servants, then later enslaved laborers. People are all of this coffee and nutmeg and spices and cinnamon and these cotton and silk piece goods and this tobacco and this rice and this indigo and all of this flowing into Western Europe is meeting a demand such as never has existed in the history of the world before, right? And I'm not trying to be economically reductionist. One really has to understand that in the kind of just molecular interaction of daily life by the later Middle Ages in Western Europe, bourgeois social relations are emerging. And they're slowly expanding, enveloping everything in Western Europe, from the brightest city square to the darkest corner of rural life. They're being brought in. And people are being made interdependent and interconnected, and they're forming a whole that's much greater than the sum of its parts. And as a result, quite common people can figure out whether they're on their small plot of land or whether they're in a workshop in Antwerp. They can figure out, how can I work harder and smarter? How can I make something really well that I can successfully sell to the market, make more income, reinvest part of that? Right? They're starting to set the course of their own existence in new ways. They're starting to become interdependent and therefore dependent on getting a lot of what they want, not from subsistence agriculture, but from the market. There's a great world of emancipatory possibilities developing, right? If you were a cloth manufacturer, right, in, let's say, London in 1500, you would have basically been dependent on a few aristocratic and urban tradition patrons. Therefore, you would have been, even though you might have had a commercial relationship to them, you would have been completely servile towards them because you just had 5 or 6 great patrons you were serving. If you're in London by 1700, you don't care about a few wealthy patrons, right? You're servicing a mass market, and that's a great site of independence and emancipation for you, if that makes sense. And so what I am trying to get at is that really the state is being subjected, is being made an agency of this self-developing bourgeois society. The state has to stop censoring newspapers. Instead, the state tries to figure out, how can I create a world where there are more people talking, discussing, debating, coming up with new ideas, applying them to manufacturing, to commerce, to overseas development, so the state can make more revenue.
Right. Well, let's go on to the next clip. But that's all very, I almost said at the end of that, hallelujah. So I'm going to say it now, hallelujah. And
Right.
let's go to the next
Power
clip.
structures independent of the British government were already well entrenched in America. Power structures designed to advance transatlantic economic interests. And since liberal government exists primarily to enrich capitalists, there must necessarily be a fair bit of flexibility within that ideology to accommodate the very different types of economic activity occurring on the vast seaboard stretching from Georgia to Maine. The collectivist ideals of Puritan settlers had long since been replaced by capitalist individualism, but many vestigial traces remained. Local town government remained the backbone of political life. New Englanders were still all about that self-important city on a hill type stuff, and they definitely still hated Catholics, even if witch hunting and apocalypse prophecies had become somewhat passé. The mid-Atlantic colonies were a bit more of a mix of power structures. The urban centers of New York City and Philadelphia were the apotheosis of early American capitalism. Diverse and cosmopolitan, these were major industrial centers and hubs of transatlantic trade. Influenced by Dutch rationalism and Quaker tolerance, they were also fiercely socially liberal, with long traditions of freedoms of speech, religion, and the press. New York and Pennsylvania were both ruled by a royal governor, but he shared power with legislatures dominated by wealthy local merchants. And on the bleeding edge of the liberal spectrum were the slave societies of the South. Obviously, Virginians didn't call one half of their bicameral legislature the House of Burgesses for nothing, but the extent to which the southern colonies were capitalist is highly debatable. During the English Civil Wars, the House of Burgesses had supported Parliament, but the General Assembly and the royal governor supported the monarchy. And in the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion, a late 17th century lower-class uprising against the planter elite, that same governor consolidated power within the General Assembly, which represented the interests of the most powerful plantation owners, setting the stage for the decidedly anti-democratic slaveholder oligarchy of the Old South. And as varied as these systems of power were, one thing united all of these different visions of American liberalism: their close proximity to the colonial project. From the very first liberal power structures ever devised in British North America, the direct democracies of Plymouth Colony and Massachusetts Bay, American liberalism was full of Puritan rhetoric about freedom, equality, and self-determination. Of course, simultaneously, these same colonists were hunting witches, executing religious dissidents, enslaving Africans, and committing genocide against Native Americans. Many people see this as a glaring paradox, a fundamental contradiction within the liberal American experiment. These people are missing the point. The system was working exactly as intended. There is no inconsistency here. Again, what is the point of liberalism? Why does it exist? Its function was to provide a state which would liberate the burgesses from feudalism and unleash the full potential of capitalist commerce. So you do have genuine freedom within a certain circle of privileged citizenry. It was a much bigger circle than feudalism's, and that's commendable, but it was still relatively small. In early New England, you had to be a white Puritan male to be within that circle. In the Mid-Atlantic, you had to be a white male landowner or merchant, but your religion didn't really matter as much. In the South, you had to be a plantation owner. Inside the circle, things were really nice, but the view outside the circle was that of a bristling phalanx that was coming for you and was going to take all of your shit. American freedom was never meant to apply to everyone. Its economy was based on extraction. How on earth can an extractive economy really function if there actually is liberty and justice for all?
All right. So what do you make of that?
So I have two really strong disagreements with it. Let me begin with the latter part of the presentation. He argues that the wealth of this world, of what he's calling capitalism, what I would call bourgeois society, was due to extraction. That is, the conquest, plunder, and removal of resources away from outside of it and drawing it into itself. I just really disagree with that. I couldn't disagree more profoundly. What happens in the West is a takeoff into self-sustaining growth. That is to say, you're in, you're out. There across the early modern period, we see increases, really principally, sorry, I shouldn't say the early modern period as a whole, but the 17th and 18th century, across large swaths of Western Europe, most importantly, Northwestern Europe, you see increases in labor productivity. That is, the amount of goods and services that can be produced with the same labor force in the same labor time. You see increases in the productivity of labor. You see increases in the overall output of goods and services. You see increases in the per capita income, the household, the wealth per household. That kind of, I mean, I really think that there's an incredibly crude imagination behind formulas like this that is almost pre-modern. And I don't mean any insult to the gentleman presenting. He says many interesting things. But I think a lot of us simply have lost sight of or don't really grasp what happened in the Western world in the early modern period in terms of the economic takeoff that took place. There was just not simply a bit more wealth, a bit more niceties and fineries. There was a raising of the basement of civilization like had never been seen before. Across the length and breadth of social life, there was the raising of the basement, the improvement in the conditions of people. And you can measure this in all sorts of ways: the clothes they wear, the food they eat, what's in their households, the comforts in their households, the cutlery, the glassware, the portraiture. There's all number of ways. If you look at, say, Northwestern Europe and the colonies of British North America, which are essentially an extension of developments going on in the British Isles and in Northwestern Europe, you see a quality of life that is improving across the board for free people. And that really cannot possibly be explained as based on the extraction of resources or the expropriation of resources from other people. Now, the two may be related to each other, and I'm not denying that. That is to say, obviously, a great deal of colonial development in British North America depends on the expropriation of land from indigenous people. But you can't understand the fertility and the wealth being produced on that land through the act of expropriation itself. Rather, you really have to understand that wealth is bound up with the new social relations that have come into being. The way that seemingly paradoxical societies developed of growing individual independence and self-determination, but nevertheless growing dependence on others, interdependence socially and economically with others. That is, we're no longer in a world of subsistence agriculture, where family households are spinning and weaving the clothes they need, maintaining the shelter they live in, and growing the food and necessities of life. Rather, they're focusing on offering some good or service, and in return, making money or working for others and making a wage and going back out and buying what they need. And that is a world of two really new, spontaneously, freely developing divisions of labor. That is, there's a division of labor in society. Different regions and areas and people are focusing on producing different goods and services, and a detailed division of labor within certain productive units, factories and workshops, where merchants and manufacturers are hiring free laborers and breaking them up into a kind of specialized process where, as Adam Smith famously explains, is an example of the pin factory, which he's getting from Diderot's encyclopedia and his own empirical observation in Scotland. Laborers are being broken up into doing different aspects of the pin, such as the wiring or the pin head and so on and so forth. And it's those developments that really increase mastery of skills, mastery of dexterity. Really, it's that division of labor in society where people aren't making all the goods and services they need, but rather focusing on producing a particular good or service, and detailed division of labor within a workshop where people are focusing on some specialized task and producing the commodity. That so increases efficiency, mastery, dexterity, that people can figure out ways to make those things much more quickly, much more efficiently, and even begin to develop new technologies and tools that help them make it much more efficiently and quickly. And that really, Doug, is what's raising the basement of civilization. And it's that really which is creating higher quality, lower cost goods and services on the market like never before. And that is really what's this engine of labor productivity and self-sustaining economic growth. You cannot explain it as extraction. It is often the case that, of course, as Europeans went to expand overseas, there was conquest, there was enslavement. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. Nobody can seriously question that. The enslavement, conquest, expropriation were deeply bound up with this period of the development of bourgeois society. But at the beating heart of this bourgeois society is a system of free labor that is indeed making possible and necessitating European overseas expansion, which is an expansion like never before. It's not that they're simply expanding across territories like's happened throughout all of human history. From 1500 on, they're exploring, mapping, conquering, colonizing across the globe, right? Throughout the Americas, throughout Asia. They're connecting the old world of Europe, Africa, and Asia like never before. They've discovered for the old world, the new world of the Americas. They're creating connections and interdependencies in between them. So I think it's entirely wrong to imagine that the wealth of the Western world is based on extraction. You can't get there. You really can't. Extraction, plunder, conquest, the taking of some people's resources and the giving to other people has happened throughout recorded history. Indeed, it is the history of civilization. Mm-hmm. But what's going on in the West is the raising of the basement of civilization, the improvement of the life of all people, common people, is such as never been seen before. Now, I realize I've gone at length, but let me address.
Well, can I just make one intervention here? I recall at one point, I don't know when it was exactly, but I think it was in the 90s, Christopher Hitchens was being asked about what he thought about Columbus Day and the genocide against Native Americans and whether or not we should be happy to celebrate Columbus Day and what he thought about the plight of Native Americans. And he said, well, of course, he was against the treatment of the Native Americans, and of course they should be struggling for their rights. But if it wasn't for Columbus and the Pilgrims and the discovery of the New World, life in the United States or in America would be very boring, and that we should all be very grateful for the way in which history developed, as brutal as it was. And of course, that was an outrage. That was, to say that the Native Americans were boring. But I'll just add to that and say, I met later on a woman from Canada who was actually marrying my best friend, and she grew up on a reservation. She was, indigenous to, or partly indigenous to Canada, or what have you. And I asked her if her life there was more rewarding. As a typical kind of, Stalinist type new leftist without a lot of thinking, I asked, did you enjoy life on the reservation more because you had traditional, culture and a way to connect to life that might have been deeper than what you experience, in cities and such? And she said, no, we didn't have any culture. What are you talking about? We had, some rooms, and we didn't have a TV until I was, 15, and, and my dad drank, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's kind of an illusion about what life was like before modernity that people cling to, that it was somehow more fulfilling, romantic, and ignoring exactly what you are pointing out about how the standard of living, and to say it that way is to miss it, maybe, was how it was raised up, and how so many more opportunities were created for so many people through the development of bourgeois society and capitalism. So it's just, you can pick that up and do with it what you want, but those are my two anecdotes.
No, I'd like to respond to it, and actually it would lead me into the second thing I wanted to say, which is, I think you're rightly criticizing the romantic notion of what the pre-Columbus world looked like in North America. But my concern about the Christopher Hitchens statement is it implies a certain inertness or static character to indigenous society before the arrival of Columbus. There, of course, was a great deal of historical developments and evolutions taking place amongst the indigenous people of North America. The issue that I have with a great deal of contemporary politics like land back or whatnot, or say when people give land acknowledgements, right?
Mm-hmm.
The land acknowledgement is almost always basically based on where we're here in the United States or Canada, have you talking. Is the historic home of of an indigenous community dating back to before the development of the United States and Canada. My problem with that is it was the home of a different indigenous community prior to that one. That is to say, there was a whole period of warfare, of settlement, of dynamic encounters, exclusions, transformations that took place across centuries before Europeans ever showed up in North America. And what's often presented is some vision that there was a harmonious, wonderful indigenous society. That is to say, there were incredibly complex indigenous societies, different communities, different forms of land tenure and organization, warring with one another, etc. If you really want to do land acknowledgements, it's turtles all the way down. There will be one oppressor, and then there'll be another oppressor and enslaver, and then there'll be another oppressor and enslaver. That is, I'm sorry to say, just simply the history of human communities, of civilization. What makes bourgeois society different, Doug, is exactly what you're talking about, which is that the oppression and exploitation, the enslavement and brutality that was involved in bourgeois society's unfolding is not necessary to bourgeois society. And in fact, bourgeois radicals, people who came to really systematically reflect upon and think about the conditions and possibilities of bourgeois society, they became extremely critical of those forms of enslavement, oppression, exploitation. So what I would say is that the history of civilization is a history of the oppression and exploitation and domination and enslavement of some people by other people. And if you want to do land acknowledgements, fine, but don't stop at one. Keep going all the way back. We know about a community before the community you just acknowledged. Why aren't you acknowledging them? It goes on endlessly. What bourgeois society makes possible in its massive increase in labor productivity is the idea that every single human being can become a free, self-determining laborer, can set the course of their own existence and enter into meaningful work and activity where they can offer something to society and they can earn something, money, by which they go out and get what they want from society. That's the kind of emancipatory character of bourgeois society. It's a self-developing, spontaneously developing division of labor. It's not determined by overt domination or caste distinctions or any kind of overt hierarchy. Rather, the social practices at its core are that people become self-determining free laborers that set the course of their own existence. But if they want access to the means and mechanisms to reproduce themselves, they have to offer something to society. You have to be a good tool maker. You have to be a good haberdasher. You have to be a good merchant. You have to be a good teacher. You have to be a good lawyer. You have to be a good nurse. You have to find something that you're good at, that you find enjoyable, that then you do well enough that other people want your good or your service and therefore give you money. So you set the course of your own existence and you freely draw on resources created by society as a whole to increasingly be able to determine yourself. And the point about bourgeois society, while its emergence in the late medieval and early modern period was bound up with a great deal of exploitation, expropriation, oppression, enslavement, those things were not necessary to its fundamental practices and institutions. Indeed, many radicals and revolutionaries within bourgeois society came to see those forms of enslavement and oppression and exploitation as worse because they weren't necessary. They were surplus to requirements. They were counterproductive. And this takes me to the other point I wanted to make about the recent clip you just played, Doug, which he's making the classic mistake of conflating liberalism with what everybody thought in society at the time. Now, I won't deny that liberalism has some relationship to society as a whole, okay? But I want to say something. The word liberalism did not come into existence until the 19th century, right? It was coined in the 19th century, and the real reason why it's coined is because liberalism has gone into a profound crisis. which is that bourgeois society has entered into contradiction with itself. Its forces of production have entered into contradiction with its relations of production through the fully developed capitalist mode of production that emerges with large-scale large-scale industry and machine production after the Industrial Revolution. And because liberalism has gone into crisis, it becomes a kind of ideologically vulgar and defensive phenomenon. That's liberalism. That's people like John Stuart Mill. But liberalism or proto-liberalism, or what basically are the kind of ideological lineages of 19th century liberalism, are really a set of very critical, radical, revolutionary views that develop in the 17th and 18th century. As bourgeois society fully emerges and develops in Western Europe, above all in Northwestern Europe and the British Isles, by the 17th and 18th century, the 1600s and 1700s, there are writers, intellectuals, who are increasingly reflecting upon the world they live in, the conditions and possibilities that it entails. And they begin to see within it new emancipatory possibilities that go well beyond what's developed, right? So you begin to see someone like John Locke realizes that government can be much more based on the consent of the governed than it is. That government still, by the late 17th century, across much of Western Europe, understands itself as based on something outside of society. That is, it's based on God, or it's based on blood, or it's based on lineage and hereditary status and inheritance. And it's radicals like Locke and Pierre Delacour in the Netherlands and others who come to see that no, government should be wholly based on society. It should be based on the consent of the governed. That people who exercise sovereign authority over you should be understood to be wholly come out of the society and be based on the consent of the society over which they exercise that authority. And these people are radicals and revolutionaries. They're not just simply, the way everybody thinks. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there's a relationship between what I'm calling here proto-liberalism or radical bourgeois thought and the society existent. Marx famously said in his writings in the 1840s, I believe I'm forgetting now. It's either Doug, I apologize. I normally have this stuff to hand, but I didn't think to have it ready. It's either in the Holy Family or the German Ideology. Marx says liberalism is just the practical everyday consciousness of liberalism is just a set of doctrines rooted in the practical everyday consciousness of life in bourgeois society. In fact, his great line, and again, it's either the Holy Family or the German Ideology, he says that liberalism is the practical idealism of everyday life in bourgeois society. So yes, does the fact that Locke thinks the government should be based on the consent of the governed, is that ultimately rooted in bourgeois society? Yes, it is. Meaning he's seeing possibilities in a world of civil society, commercial society, where people are freely cooperating. He's seeing that actually this cooperation is its own justification. This cooperation is the grounds of its own existence. It doesn't need anything outside of itself. It doesn't need God. It doesn't need bloodlines. It doesn't need race. It doesn't need lineage. It needs only itself to justify itself. And clearly, I don't think Locke could have had that possibility or that realization if he were not living in Northwestern Europe and the British Isles in the late 17th century, which was the epicenter of the unfolding of world bourgeois society, where there were the most free laborers, the most people freely interacting, exchanging, associating in daily life. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean that everybody was thinking that way. Locke was systematically reflecting on, both on his own and in a world of correspondence and debate and discussion with others, both at the University of Oxford where he taught, but also with people in the Royal Society and other associations in London, and with the World Republic of Letters that was not just in Western Europe, but stretched beyond there into Eastern Europe, into Russia, into North Africa, into the Americas. In a World Republic of Letters, he was coming to reflect upon the kind of conditions of existence in this world and what were kind of unrealized potentialities and possibilities in this world, and trying to publish his ideas and influence others. So my problem with the gentleman saying liberalism just believed this, that it was inclusive for white slave planters and merchants within it and exclusive people outside of it, it's a wrong way to understand it. Liberalism is, while it's ultimately made possible by everyday life in bourgeois society, while it is exactly what Marx said, the practical idealism of everyday life in bourgeois society, nevertheless, it really is a set of doctrines and ideas of quite radical, revolutionary, critical thinkers that we ultimately associate with the Enlightenment, that have come to become aware of possibilities and potentialities slumbering within an unfolding bourgeois society that have not yet been realized, right? That if a hereditary aristocracy is reduced in power, if land is not solely based on inheritance, but becomes available to people that can work at the hardest and the smartest, if people can freely set the course of their own existence, if there's freedom of the press, if there's freedom of association, if people are allowed to determine where they live, who they love, when they get married, that this is kind of the world of liberalism. It is, I'm sorry to use this term, the critical theory of bourgeois society in the 18th century. Not a critical theory in the sense that this society itself has become contradictory, but rather this society has possibilities that can solve the problems that exist. I'm going to put this very crudely, Doug, and I promise I've gone on too long here. Bill Clinton said in one of his, I believe, either his first or second inauguration, that there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. I would say that at the core of radical enlightenment or radical bourgeois or liberal thinking of the later 17th and 18th century is that there's nothing wrong with bourgeois society that can't be fixed by what's right with bourgeois society. But these people were incredibly critical of a great deal of the oppression and exploitation going on. And I actually think, although the gentleman doesn't intend it, it becomes kind of apologetic for the unfolding course of events. Well, it could have only ever have been this way, right? It could have only have developed this way. No, that's simply not true. There was an incredible enslavement of people of African descent in the colonies, particularly in the tobacco colonies of the Chesapeake, Maryland, and Virginia. But nevertheless, there had emerged small communities of free blacks by the eve of the American Revolution. Many of them were participating in public life, in political life, and in fact participated on both sides of the American Revolution. That is, as loyalists and as patriots and radical Whigs. And there were many people, right, not just both white and black within the patriot and revolutionary movement that became extremely critical of slavery and thought that it was not just a crime against the people that were enslaved, but it was a crime against the society that had slavery because it was a hindrance on further developments. And so what I would say, Doug, is that really liberal thought is radical bourgeois thought. And at its core, radical bourgeois thought realizes that a new society has come into existence, but there are elements in the world that hinder or block that society, whether they're hereditary aristocracies or feudal privileges or legal distinctions between castes or mercantile monopolies. Whatever those obstacles are, they need to be removed, and bourgeois society needs to come into its own as a society of free labor. And those people were quite critical in many respects of what had happened and what was happening with slavery, what had happened to indigenous societies in the Americas, so on and so forth.
Well, listen, that's great. And I'm going to go on to the next clip. We have two more to get through, and then I want to talk about how this kind of thinking came to dominate what's called the left. And I have a few questions about, we might speculate about how this video that we're commenting on came to be. But here is the fourth clip.
Radical populist groups emerged from the ranks of lower middle and working class colonists, smugglers, mechanics, artisans, and farmers, who were angry about their increasingly desperate economic circumstances. Foremost among them was the Boston chapter of the Sons of Liberty, led by the failed businessman and disaffected intellectual Samuel Adams. In the height of the crisis caused by the Stamp Act, Adams and his sons rioted, burned effigies in the streets, attacked the homes of customs officers, and destroyed legal records. A campaign of direct action so successful that during the summer of 1765, the Sons of Liberty were effectively in control of the city of Boston. And it worked. Parliament backed down and repealed the Stamp Act. But this only kicked the can down the road. The British government was still £130 million in debt, and they had to find that money somewhere. 2 years later, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, a series of duties on colonial imports, sparking a new wave of protests. Though they repeated the tried-and-true tactics of economic pressure and direct action, the Bostonians at the center of this resistance were eventually undercut by New York merchants, who broke the British boycott. Typical New York. Parliament had won this round, and what's more, they'd established the dominance of their mighty imperial power structures over the colonies' cute little provincial ones. Finally, in 1773, an emboldened Parliament enacted its most brazen mercantile outrage yet, giving the struggling East India Company a monopoly on American tea sales. The indomitable Sons of Liberty responded by boarding 3 ships moored in Boston Harbor and destroying over 92,000 pounds of East India Company tea. So, in 1774, George III declared to his Prime Minister Lord North that the New England colonies were in a state of rebellion, and sent troops to occupy Boston. The fuse of revolution had now been irrevocably lit. While traditional history marks the beginning of the War of Independence on April 19, 1775, with Lexington conquered and all that, a more appropriate start date might be September 5th, 1774, the first meeting of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Though it was not yet a foregone conclusion that the political bands with Great Britain would be dissolved, this was still an explicitly revolutionary act. Violence is not necessarily what wins revolutions. What wins revolutions are viable alternate power structures, which run parallel to, then eventually overcome and replace, existing power structures. In November of that year, Congress called for, quote, committees in county, city, and town to organize and enforce its economic opposition to British policies. In places where the burgesses and planters already had anti-British economic interests, these committees were simply a continuation of rule by the old elite. But notably, in cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Albany, the committees were a popular movement of newly radicalized lower-class mechanics, who were allied with, but not necessarily led by, politically sympathetic local merchants. These revolutionary committees were localized, but all followed a single continental strategy of economic sabotage. They were a solid organizational right flank, providing direction and focus for their paramilitary left flank made up of the Sons of Liberty and others, who seized and destroyed boycott-breaking goods and attacked the properties, reputations, and sometimes even persons of the merchants trading them. Of course, all this was highly illegal, and at first the committees met in secret at private homes and taverns. But as the crisis deepened and their momentum grew, the revolutionary movement began operating out in the open. In October 1774, John Hancock, Paul Revere, and other notable Boston organizers formed the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, the first official American counter-government. Since all political power flows from the barrel of a gun, one of their first orders of business was to assemble a loyal military force who could operate with impunity in areas outside of the control of the British Army. Backed by the various town militias of Middlesex County, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress opened jails, appointed officers of the peace, and summoned citizens to mandatory public meetings. By the spring of 1775, rural Massachusetts was firmly under the control of a revolutionary junta. I feel like a lot of people just assume that when the British marched to Concord, the populace was just so incensed by this flagrant display of military despotism that they spontaneously rose up, grabbed their muskets, kissed their beautiful blonde wives and lily-white children goodbye, and marched with steely resolve to the Old North Bridge and Lexington Town Common. But no, that's not quite how revolution works, is it? Without this extra-legal, extra-statist power structure, there is no Lexington. There is no Concord. Successful revolutions are never spontaneous. They are all organized. Every single one. So thus, a radical populist movement, despite being an overall minority within the general population, was able to seize power in large swaths of the American colonies.
What do you make of that?
I actually think that's the best of the clips that you've played so far. I agree with much of what he said. I have some minor empirical disagreements, but I think that's the weeds and we don't have to get into that. in the big picture, what I agree with is his point that people do tend to think Lexington and Concord, or just in everyday life, took place more or less like he characterizes them. Where in fact, what happened at Lexington and Concord is two alternative state structures came face to face, right?
Mhm.
He's describing, there's a classic distinction made in the historical social science literature between a rebellion and a potentially revolutionary situation. And a
Mhm.
rebellion might feature a lot of spontaneous or spasmodic violence. But what separates a rebellion from a potentially revolutionary situation is the development of a kind of embryonic state structure that's a real alternative to the existing command centers. Of course, this situation was famously described by Lenin, although he wasn't the first one to talk about it as dual power. He gave it the name dual power, but really it predates him into a 19th century literature. But the point being is that if you look at the reason why we can say, I agree with him, by the way, that 1774 should be seen as really the first year of the American Revolution, broadly speaking. There's actually a very good book on this, a recent one by the historian Mary Beth Norton called 1774, The Year of Revolution, that I think lays this out in beautiful and brilliant empirical detail. But the point I would make is this. If you look at the period 1763 to 1774, that broadly is an imperial crisis, meaning it has three phases. There's the first phase of the imperial crisis, the Stamp Act phase, the second phase, the Townsend Duty phase, and the third phase that ends really with the Boston Tea Party in December 1773. And throughout that period, more or less 11 years, the goal of the colonial American resistance movement is to achieve the repeal of the new imperial taxes and regulations put in place after the 7 Years' War. And insofar as they have a maximal goal, meaning their minimal goal is the repeal of the new imperial regulations and taxes, insofar as they have a maximal goal, it's not really American independence. Rather, it's a reformed British Empire. They want a British Empire that is more inclusive or includes in decision-making processes more colonial assemblies, colonial councils, right? So really in that 11-year period, 1763 to 1774, the goal is essentially to get the repeal of the new imperial regulations and taxes and to get a reformed British Empire that includes colonial councils and assemblies and empire-wide decision-making processes.
Mhm.
It's really in 1774, not that the movement of independence becomes majoritarian, because the movement of independence doesn't become a dominant view in public opinion until the winter and spring of 1776, all right?
Mhm.
But what happens in 1774, Doug, is precisely what the gentleman says. There begins to be formed committees of secrecy, committees of correspondence, committees of safety. And what those committees begin doing at kind of local and provincial colonial levels is maintaining practices and features that we would see as associated with states. They're running the postal service. They're maintaining law and order. They're maintaining the jails. They're committees of correspondence, writing to and communicating with one another. They're building and developing militias and weapons depots. In other words, these committees are developing across the colonies, and all 13 of them from Georgia to New Hampshire. And they're essentially, although they're locally and spontaneously being organized, they're then establishing correspondence between one another and beginning to coordinate not only within colonies, but across colonies. And so you're seeing emerge embryonically in a kind of shadow form an alternative revolutionary state structure that stands in opposition to the formal state of the British Empire. That is the crown and the officials of the British Empire. I'm talking here royal governors, colonial councils and assemblies, and redcoats, right? Members of the Hanoverian British Army and so forth. And what's happening, Doug, is these two state structures are basically in competition throughout 1774 and 1775, and they really come to a head at Lexington and Concord, right? They really fire shots at one another at Lexington and Concord. But what we can see happening is essentially you get the Boston Tea Party in December 1773. Then in response to that, starting in late winter, early spring 1774, Parliament passes the Coercive Acts, which is meant essentially to destroy civilian government in Massachusetts Bay and create a military martial law government, and really to set an example. And as a result, you get a great deal of support for Boston and Massachusetts across the colonies. There it begins to develop these committees of safety, these committees of militias, these committees of correspondence. They begin to interact with one another, not just within colonies, but across colonies, and an embryonic structure forms. And then eventually, Doug, as you go through 1774 and 1775, the traditional legitimate authorities, the colonial assemblies and colonial councils, they become meaningless. Why? Because what's happened is these town and county committees have essentially started to elect representatives to go to these things they call in some colonies provincial congress, or in some colonies they call it colonial convention. There's all these conventions and congresses forming that are basically alternative legislatures, alternative assemblies to the already existing colonial assemblies and councils. So these colonial committees are giving rise to provincial conventions and provincial congresses. And then finally, and here I really agree with the gentleman, ultimately they create an intercolonial convention or an intercolonial congress known as the First Colonial Congress that meets in Philadelphia later in 1774. And then that is eventually replaced in 1775 by the Second Continental Congress, which of course becomes the first Congress of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So
and you know
what I situation, the picture he's painting there. And I think that's what makes the American Revolution not simply spasmodic violence and rebellion, but a potentially revolutionary situation, which one difference I do want to introduce, sorry to interrupt you, Doug, is I still think until about the fall of 1775, there was a hope of those who manned and staffed that alternative shadow revolutionary state structure. There was a hope that their political movement would not simply be British American, but would be British European as well. That is, that would involve the entire British imperial world, that essentially bourgeois radicals, Enlightenment radicals, Wilkesite radicals, meaning followers of John Wilkes, the radical Whig in Britain, that they would join them, if not an outright rebellion, in a kind of political movement. And their hope was these people in the First Continental Congress and in these provincial congresses and conventions, their hope was they would be part of a British imperial world movement that wasn't just on the eastern seaboard of North America, but was in Ireland, was in the West Indies, was in Britain itself, above all, even in London, the capital of it all, with Whitehall and Westminster. And this movement would exert tremendous pressure on the regime of Parliament and King George III to reform itself. At home, what would reform mean? It would mean Parliament opening itself up to representatives from the developing banking, manufacturing, mercantile classes and groups, Parliament becoming more representative of the kind of urban commercial world that had developed in Great Britain. Even a few of these radicals were talking about universal manhood suffrage, right? Like Thomas Paine. And then they also thought that that would allow the command centers in Britain, in Westminster and Whitehall, to allow colonial assemblies to have a greater role in empire-wide making processes. So what I think most of these proto-revolutionaries in these provincial congresses and conventions in British North America and in the First Continental Congress hoped for was a reformed kind of radical Whig British Empire that would have a more inclusive parliament in Britain and greater roles for colonial assemblies in empire-wide decision-making. And you would have a kind of reformed empire of liberty, if you will. But they lose hope in that, particularly by the fall of 1775, after King George III basically issues a proclamation saying anybody who is still in a state of rebellion against legitimate authority will now be hung, right? That is, from here on out, you know, he declares in, I can't remember, it's either late August, early September 1775, this is it, right? Martial law in the colonies. Anybody who doesn't get in line will be killed, right? And so that essentially forces the issue away from a reformed British Empire, a radical Whig British Empire of liberty, towards a kind of independent America, right? And of course, that movement reaches its fever pitch with Thomas Paine's publication of Common Sense, where Thomas Paine is just laying out the radical Whig project, the radical Whig playbook for a much greater reformed empire of liberty. But now he's essentially saying it can only be achieved by American independence. It can no longer be achieved within a wider British imperial world.
Mm-hmm. Listening to that section of this video, I felt that it helped me actually think about something that I'm getting involved with, that Sublation is getting involved with right now, which is the campaign for a socialist party, where we're attempting to go out and to the world and set up socialist institutions, joining in with working class institutions that are already existing in civil society, to attempt to develop a kind of proto party and a something like this. Might be something like the letters of correspondence being set up in some ways, and also just attempting to create these alternative sources of power from free people in society. Do you see a correspondence there between what the campaign is attempting to in the long term do and what was done in the American Revolution?
You're talking about civil social organizing, essentially?
Yeah.
Well, I think that is vital. That is before there can really be the rebirth of a proletarian socialist political movement. A great deal of civil social organizing has to take place that is completely not related to or determined by the electoral calendar. Meaning there has to be civil social organizing amongst socialists and people in everyday life that is in no way, shape, or form, follows the rhythm of the next election, right? That completely honestly is just indifferent to the political calendar and the combat between the two capitalist parties, the Republicans and Democrats. I agree with that. Where I would sort of emphasize, though, the radical difference between the kind of civil social organizing you're talking about, Doug, and you're involved in with the Campaign for a Socialist Party, is that the task is much more difficult. Because if you go back to that crude expression I used, borrowing from Bill Clinton, right? Enlightenment radicals thought there was nothing wrong with developing bourgeois society that couldn't be fixed by what's right with developing bourgeois society. The issue we face as socialists is that it's really the beating heart of bourgeois society that's become the problem, right? That is, that bourgeois society itself has entered into crisis and contradiction, right? That the forces of production have come into contradiction with the relations of production. And therefore, simply expanding the institutions and practices of a free society, simply making free labor and the ability to set the course of one's own existence available to anybody, isn't going to deal with the problems we face under capitalism. Don't get me wrong. I think, of course, movements to tear down remnants of racial segregation, movements to further carry out women's emancipation, right? Movements to expand the rights to be a freely self-determining laborer to everybody are fundamentally important and shouldn't be discounted. But the achievement of those things can't possibly address the problems at the heart of the capitalist mode of production, which is that we've created a world where it's, as Horkheimer famously put it, it's not work that's been rendered superfluous, but the workers that have been rendered superfluous. So I agree with you. Civil social organizing is absolutely necessary. And it is absolutely the case that one should not believe that revolutions are created spontaneously. Revolutions are based on long periods of prior civil social organizing and political organization and development. Many people have a mistaken notion that revolutions just emerge spontaneously. I mean, what triggers a revolution may be an unforeseen and often is an unintended or spontaneous development. But the idea that one can take advantage of that politically new or fraught situation, the developments, that really can only exist. It can only really be wielded and taken advantage of if there's been if there's a politically organized movement that exists to take advantage of it. And that has to be based on a long prior period of civil social organizing amongst workers and intellectuals. But I would really say that the task of such a proletarian socialist movement is much more difficult than the task of bourgeois radicals. Bourgeois radicals in the 18th century had to tap the potentials that existed in bourgeois society. The proletarian socialist movement has to attempt to conquer political power just to open up the possibilities for us to begin to collectively, self-consciously deliberate about how we might be able to overcome the contradictions of bourgeois society. We might be able to open up the possibility we're not workers, but work is rendered superfluous.
Here's how I've been thinking about this, and correct me, please do correct me if I'm off. But I see us in a society now which has been through a process of monopolization and political defeat and the expansion of big capital within the state. We live in a society that has been statified to such a degree that the notion that people can be self-determining, set their own course in life, develop themselves to participate in society and contribute to society, and in exchange develop a path for their own life and society's future in life. That has been almost snuffed out as just an idea. Like people don't believe it. And it's considered to be a right-wing idea today to a large extent. So I feel as though by reaching out to the already existing world of society, of civil society institutions that already exist in various ways, some of them legally, some of them underground, and participating in that and participating in the self-development of society on that basis. So we might be setting up something that has the potential to eventually be that alternative state that would confront the existing capitalist state, and so that's where I saw a correlation between what we're doing now and what the revolutionaries were doing before 1776. That they were building up alternative institutions of power within the colonies, within society there, rather than relying upon the power from the British state to direct their associations and going around them. So
I follow the analogy of what you're saying. I follow your analogy, and I couldn't agree with you more that statist thinking has become totally dominant on the left. Many people who will listen to this, right, no matter how much time or how much detail we went into, many people will listen to this will think, Doug, that we're just libertarians, right? That we're just, that we're not socialists, that in fact we're simply libertarians. The one thing I would say in response to that is I think that contemporary libertarianism is about unleashing the individual within society as it currently exists, right? Socialists have the task to think about how the human individual could be much freer and different than they currently are, but not simply within the society that exists, but within a society that does not yet exist, but might be possible, if that makes sense. Meaning libertarians accept more or less the present as an eternal condition. And so when they want to get the state off the back, whether it's of an individual or of an enterprise, they basically accept the present as eternal condition and just free up the specific individual or the specific enterprise. We're talking about possibilities for individual development that cannot be realized under capitalism, right? That can only be realized if we emancipate society from the grip of capitalism, right? That is, if we can create a proletarian socialist movement that can capture political power and begin to open up a process where we might be able, through a free association of producers, through the socialization of means of production, move beyond, right, wage labor or free labor as a necessity to live, and instead open up whole new possibilities of wealth that are beyond the simple accumulation of commodities, but have to do with leisure and time and how one sets the course of one's own existence beyond work. There are whole new possibilities, or at least socialist thought, Marxists historically thought, not that we should destroy the individual in favor of the collective, but rather we face a collective problem. The collective problem has become the fact that bourgeois society is in contradiction with itself, is in crisis. The forces and relations of production in bourgeois society have entered into contradiction. Okay, we have 19th, 20th, and 21st century forces of production, but we adjudicate those forces of production through 17th and 18th century bourgeois social relations. That's a collective social problem. It cannot possibly be handled on an individual level. If you remain a libertarian and your view is, I just want to shackle the individual, the enterprise, you accept living in a world of capitalism where the possibility for being a self-determining individual is limited by the present order of society. Socialists and Marxists once thought that you needed to face this collective social problem, overcome it through a proletarian socialist movement and the dictatorship of the proletariat, at least open up the possibility of overcoming it. And through the different organization of society, you would be able to have an individual that was self-determining, freely determining in ways we cannot possibly imagine. So I would insist that libertarianism is deeply conservative in the sense it remains wedded to the idea that the present order of things is the eternal order of things. And I would insist that socialists are not anti-individualists. They insist there's a collective problem that the individual cannot possibly overcome on their own, but nevertheless that a different organization of society will open up the possibility for levels of individuation that we have not even seen yet, levels of abilities to recreate and redetermine ourselves in ways we cannot even not imagine once we're beyond, right, the necessities of wage labor and the fact that everybody has to work in order to live, or at least we begin to move beyond those necessities. As Marx said, we can expand the realm of freedom beyond the realm of necessity in ways we can't imagine yet. The Marxist hypothesis is that we've been able to do that since the Industrial Revolution, that while all of civilization is a realm of freedom based on a realm of necessity, that since the Industrial Revolution, the possibilities for expanding the realm of freedom and reducing the realm of necessity are greater than ever before. That the realm of necessity is based on a false necessity. It's not based on a natural necessity. It's based on a human-made, man-made social necessity that we can actually overcome if we reorganize society. Or at least, that's what socialists and Marxists once thought.
Yeah, and here's what I would say, that I don't disagree with you at all about the way in which libertarian thought in today's society in the United States especially is conservative, because it begins with the presupposition that the capitalist society that we're in is permanent, is natural, it cannot be overcome. It just begins with that assumption. And there are a variety of ways that it's expressed. It might be a matter of believing in marginal utility theory. It could be, whatever. It could just a bunch of ideologies that support that idea. For me, I feel as though approaching organizing, let's say, young workers, that's for a socialist, into a socialist movement that will develop over many years, should begin with confirming them as having the power and the right and the kind of natural heritage of self-development. Now, not after we get the Democrats into office and get welfare fixed or Medicare for all, or not once we get UBI set up or something like that. But no, right now, under these conditions, you can improve yourself, and we can work together in mutual support to improve all of our conditions in this area, in this group. And then when we run up against problems that require us to think beyond that and to think a level deeper, we could do that together and develop politically that way. But rather than starting with the statement, this society as it is will simply beat you down. There's no path forward for you as an individual, and there's no path forward for society collectively until we have a revolution. In which case, okay, well, that's putting the cart before the horse. We have to as Steve says, we have to have some thoroughbreds here. We have to have some people who are improving themselves, who are struggling in society as it is, who are working together on that basis. So what do you make of that?
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think
Yeah.
there's nothing in the contemporary political order in the United States that prevents us from doing the kind of civil social organizing you're talking about, right?
Mhm.
You know, there are freedoms of association, there are freedoms of assembly, there are freedoms of speech that would fully allow us to pursue building a proletarian socialist movement.
Right.
There's no impediment. I mean, sure, academics, professors, intellectuals have been writing books about every impediment in the way to that. Oh, how, you can write, we don't need another 10 books telling us the Constitution was written by slaveholders, therefore we can't possibly pursue social emancipation. I mean, it's just not necessary. There's plenty of books that say that already. All right.
Mhm.
So, okay, if you want to change the Constitution, how are you going to change it? Right? What's the social agency for that change? It's not your book. It's not the 963rd book pointing out that some slaveholders were involved in writing the Constitution and that, oh, there are 2 senators in Wyoming and 2 senators in California, and it's not proportionate to their population. You can write, another book saying that. But I mean, I really don't see what the point is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's watch this last clip here.
Ethnicity and religion were powerful indicators of in-group preference in the colonies, which were rife with white supremacy and anti-Catholic xenophobia. So within that culture, to degrade a proud Protestant white male citizen to the role of a subject was an outrage. British tyranny wasn't just economically disadvantageous. Suffering through it was actively shameful. So what is a gentleman to do when his honor is so affronted? Why, throw down his glove and issue a challenge, of course. Revolutions usually kick off during a swell of popular radicalism, which builds and builds and builds to a frenzy of irrational passion before exploding in a climax of violence. But then things spiral out of control, the human cost mounts, and a post-coital clarity sinks in, which often then leads to counter-revolution, or at the very least, moderate voices gaining influence in the movement. The Revolutionary War was no different in this regard. This happened to the Confederates in the American Civil War, when the fire-eating radicalism of naked white supremacy, which had seemed unstoppable in 1860, was a source of embarrassment to the political class by 1863. And leaders like Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, who had once played to the fire-eating crowd, later wisely soft-pedaled the role of slavery in secession to curry international support. But examining the rage militaire of a revolution can nonetheless be extremely useful, because the raw emotion of these periods tends to peel the onion of ideology and reveal the fundamental anxieties and psychological impulses beneath. And accounts by American revolutionaries at this time overwhelmingly point to a bone-deep conviction of their own national, cultural, and spiritual importance. They weren't just throwing off a local tyranny. Their struggle had global, even cosmic implications. As one anonymous rebel soldier put it in a New Jersey newspaper, "We ought to rejoice that the Almighty Governor of the universe hath given us a station so honourable, and planted us the guardians of liberty, while the greatest part of mankind rise and fall, undistinguished as bubbles on the common stream." Americans were chosen by God to lead the world into a new age of political freedom, artistic greatness, commercial prosperity, and universal public virtue. It was the revolutionary generation's destiny to suffer and struggle in the short term so that their children and their children's children could live in a perpetual utopia where tyranny, injustice, poverty, and ignorance were things of the past. This paradise would begin in the United States before spreading to engulf the entire world. In his book Common Sense, published at the tail end of the Rage Militaire in January 1776, the propagandist Thomas Paine utilized folksy, relatable diction to communicate pithy sound bites, which directed Whig colonists' many social anxieties toward a single solution: American independence. He promised them that, "We have it in our power to begin the world again." Paine sounds a bit like Christ in Revelations here, with the promise to make all things new. You'd be forgiven for thinking that these were the words of a millenarian preacher, not a rational deist. But ultimately, no matter how secular the messenger, a strong strain of apocalyptic thinking pervaded the American revolutionary message. The Puritans had believed that they were God's chosen people, the kingdom of Israel in the latter day. The Commonwealth they established in America was to be the New Jerusalem, a shining city upon a hill. American revolutionaries a century and a half later, especially those from the North, often unconsciously echoed 17th century Puritan ideas of America as a promised land for God's elect, as they forged a new national identity. Patriot and Puritan rhetoric was sometimes so similar that it was practically indistinguishable, as in this letter by Connecticut Governor Jonathan Trumbull. "The curtain is thin, yet perfectly dark, save what is revealed by the Lord. We live by faith and not by sight. We are in the latter end of the last days. The marvelous events of Providence seem to open to our view a rising empire in this Western world, to enlarge our Redeemer's kingdom, and to pull down the papacy." Politically sympathetic ministers quickly picked up on this connection and began preaching revolution from the pulpit. American Protestantism had almost always been political, going all the way back to the Plymouth Pilgrims. But the First Great Awakening earlier in the 18th century had supercharged this tendency. In 1774 and 75, Whig ministers played a role in the rage militaire almost comparable to that of social media influencers today, leveraging their cultural weight to whip up the revolutionary base and shift public opinion.
See? So I can do it just from YouTube as a social media influencer. I can get that revolution going, James. But what did you make of that clip?
I want to say something just about the presentation in general. I understand why this is a very popular video. I mean, I have to say I appreciate the costume dress. I appreciate the kind of voiceovers he does. I like a lot of his turns of phrase, like postcoital clarity. So I really think it's well done. Listen, there is this kind of, I think he describes it as a secular millenarian streak. I'm thinking around the time of the clip where he's talking about Thomas Paine's Common Sense and we have it in our power to begin the world again, right? Mm-hmm. There's no question that that strand exists, but I think that anybody on the left in March of 2025 would be extremely poorly served by cynically dismissing those ideas. That is to say, he says at one point, a lot of the American revolutionaries thought they had it in the power to begin the world over again, that they could create this whole new world with poverty gone. And he says, I think ignorance, tyranny. They did believe that. They really believe that. Like, we have that not simply in their public statements. It's not just propaganda justifying their actions. We have that in the most private memoirs and letters and correspondences with one another, right? The leaders of this revolution thought they were aiming at that, right? Now, a few years prior, many of them, you can read the writings of George Washington, you can read the writings of Benjamin Franklin, thought that they lived in the greatest possible the greatest polity in the world, the British Empire, right? Franklin famously referred to it in the late 1750s or 60s as the greatest political order human wisdom had ever invented, okay? And they thought that there was going to be progressive improvement and emancipation unfolding in this British Empire of Liberty. But because of what they had experienced during the imperial crisis, because of initially their opposition to the new British imperial taxes and regulations that followed the 7 Years' War, and then in their growing confrontation with the British Crown and Parliament, the forces of the British Empire, they came to believe that something very unique had happened in British North America, which is that these kind of new possibilities that had been developing throughout the Atlantic world, these new possibilities of civil society, of free association, of free assembly, of freedom of worship, of freedom to read the Bible or any book you wanted, of freedom to get together and discuss and debate with others, of freedom to figure out the course of your own existence, to work how you wanted to work for who you wanted to live where you wanted to, freedoms to read and to write and to debate, that all of these things, right, had basically emerged across the Western world, but really had emerged in North America from the beginning, right? Freed from a prior background. I'm going to talk about, Doug, a kind of common historian's thesis about the United States. A common historian's thesis about the United States is the reason why it's the most liberal country is because it emerged without a feudal background. That is just simply true. That is to say that it is the case that you have bourgeois society, commercial society, whatever you want to call it, developing in colonial British North America during the 18th century with no compromise with years, indeed centuries of medieval Christian civilization as exists in Britain, as exists in Western Europe, right? And the first people to come up with that thesis are the American revolutionaries themselves, right? It's spelled out by Benjamin Franklin. It's spelled out by John Adams. It's spelled out by Alexander Hamilton. It's spelled out by others, that there are all these new forces, socially, economically, culturally. I don't mean just a merchant class, but I mean widespread literacy, widespread discussion and debate, enlightenment, all of these things broadly. There are these new intellectual, cultural, social, economic forces beyond the confines of the church, the medieval church, beyond the confines of the hereditary aristocracy, beyond the confines of the traditional ruling class, that have emerged, that have spread amongst the people, right? That have allowed for the self-enlightenment of the people through discussion and debate and conflict and competition with one another. And those forces have emerged across the West, but it's amongst the American revolutionaries that you get the first arguments or insights into the idea. The reason why these things are even more thoroughly developed here is because, as John Adams puts it, through the works of Providence, because you peopled the eastern seaboard of North America, because these new forces, these new capacities of bourgeois society crossed the Atlantic, they didn't anymore have to compromise with the canon of the feudal law, with the world of the hereditary aristocracy, the feudal nobility, the medieval church, medieval kings, medieval customs and practices. They could emerge from the beginning. They could kind of, once you had basically displaced or expropriated land from indigenous people, you could kind of begin the world over again. That a kind of world had already been begun over again. And so what Paine's drawing on there is an idea that's been developing really for a couple of years by then amongst the American revolutionaries themselves from the mid-1760s to the mid-1770s, which is really the New World isn't just new geographically for people from Europe, Africa, and Asia who didn't know about it, but a whole new world of a new society has developed there. And while some of this may exist in Europe and to a lesser degree Africa and Asia, it's really coming to its own in the Americas, principally on the eastern seaboard of North America. And so there is this kind of what the gentleman called a secular millenarian streak, right? Mm-hmm. And they believe that by achieving independence from the British Empire, from completely disconnecting themselves from any forms of hereditary aristocracy or arbitrary government or a sovereignty that understands itself as still somehow outside of society. Because even though the British have a concept of parliamentary sovereignty, most writers and politicians in Britain still think the sovereignty in Parliament is absolute, is outside of society, doesn't come from within society. The American revolutionaries come to believe that they actually, because of the play of Providence, have been able to emerge, have been able to be participants in the development of this new world of bourgeois society to a greater degree than anywhere else, and that therefore through their political activity, through achieving independence from the British Empire, from ending all forms of entail in land tenure, any forms of feudalism and land tenure, from ending any remaining vestiges of state churches or religious monopoly, from fully separating church and state, from not just not allowing pre-publication censorship, but actually writing into the Constitution an absolute freedom of speech, freedom of the press, all of those kinds of things. They believe they politically can take that new world farther than ever before, but they don't think it's limited to themselves. They think they are just the beginning. They think they're a bridgehead, Doug. They think the American revolutionaries think what they're doing in creating the United States is providing a bridgehead for the peoples of the whole world into a kind of new world, not geographically, but socially and politically. And I would just say that I just think the left should not abandon that or see that as simply ideological cover for other things going on: white supremacy, settler colonialism, class domination. I think we're really poorly served to abandon that idea. I genuinely believe that. And I don't just believe it because it's a kind of source of inspiration for us. I believe it on a much more fundamental level, which is to say, the problems we face are rooted in the fact that a form of social freedom, bourgeois society, has produced a form of social unfreedom, capitalism. Our problems are not ultimately problems of overt domination or caste discrimination or coercive exploitation. Those things still exist. I don't deny them. Okay. But by and large, liberalism, bourgeois radicalism can and will and has dealt with a lot of that. We face a new problem, which is our form of social freedom has developed within it something unprecedented, which is a form of social unfreedom. Right? What the thinker, I know we're both admirers of the Marxological work of Moïse Postone, and what Moïse Postone called, right, self-constituted domination, social domination, a domination of ourselves by ourselves, rooted ultimately in our total social practices and institutions. This unfreedom is actually rooted in our freedom. And if we take this gentleman's approach, which is that freedom wasn't real, it was just the kind of propagandistic cover, or it was limited to a few people, it never intended to extend to everybody. It was just a cover for class domination, a new form of class domination, the merchant class, or it was just a cover for white supremacy or settler colonialism. What happens then, Doug, is you're going to be susceptible to radlibism. You're just basically going to think you're going to just basically think all the problems of the world have ever been thus. Some people are overtly dominating other people. Some people are discriminating against other people. I actually think that if you don't realize, if you don't understand what's happened in the last few centuries of human history, that there's been an incredible social emancipation that we can call the rise and evolution of bourgeois society, then you don't grasp the real problems that face us, which is that the form of social freedom has become a form of unfreedom. And there are lots of ways that form of unfreedom, capitalism, alibis and obscures itself. It uses a whole degree of racial and patriarchal alibis to justify itself. I don't deny any of that, right? But nevertheless, the real problem we face is one of a new form of unfreedom that we ourselves constitute, self-constituted social domination. And we cannot possibly grasp that form of unfreedom if we don't understand that a real emancipation of humanity took place.
I would just,
prepared to simply dismiss that or to say that was all just the kind of, violent rage or military rage or apocalyptic rhetoric of some revolutionaries who got a bit hot and bothered while they were trying to secede from the British Empire.
Yeah, I had a thought that's not politically correct, but I'm going to express it anyway. That emerges from what you're saying, and it has to do with the way in which not only can the patriarchal order create justifications or become an alibi for the continued domination of the capitalist form, but it also is the case that critiques or anti-patriarchal movements can become alibis for the continuation of the capitalist form. And an example I would give is just in the last couple of days, I've been watching the Twitter explode with feminist separatist notions where they will say something like the problem in society is that men simply oppress and dominate and control the reproductive freedoms of women, and always it has been, and it's the case with all men for all time. And we simply must, and they don't say this part, but we simply must break free of them, right? We just must get away from the men. And then you find out, like, who is it saying this? It's an Indian immigrant whose mother and grandmother were, forced to participate in arranged marriages that were not to their benefit. They had no control over who they loved and who they married, for whatever reason, and so that's a remnant of a pre-modern form of life. It's not, it doesn't explain the disorder that we're really experiencing, in the West, and even really most of India anymore. I would propose, but it becomes an alibi for the continuation of all the problems of modern capitalist society. I wanted to ask you about this video and something you said at the beginning, which is that you described it as Stalinist. And I want to understand how, I don't know the politics of this YouTuber, Andrew Rakich, but he strikes me as he might be a leftist, He could be a leftist, like in the old anti-communist film. Even if he says that he's a leftist, and he tries to sell you his leftist newspaper, and he talks about Rachel Maddow, then he might be a leftist. But how has it come to be that this approach to understanding the American Revolution and understanding capitalism dominates the left, and particularly how is it that the Stalinist interpretation of history is mainstream in the United States today?
Right. Well, I of course don't know this gentleman's politics either, so I didn't mean to
Right.
suggest that he's in any way self-consciously Stalinist. I was saying in an extremely concise way, probably too concise, that over the course of the 20th century, a lot of Stalinist Marxist historians developed an approach to the bourgeois revolution that this gentleman seemed to be drawing on. Most famously, with regard to the French Revolution, there were a series of writers in the 20th century, Georges Lefebvre and Albert Souboul in France. They wrote about the French Revolution, and then a series of Marxists associated with the Communist Party of Great Britain, Christopher Hill, Rodney Hilton, Eric Hobsbawm, Dobb, I'm forgetting his first name. They developed a approach to the English Revolution in the 17th century that was similar. And what this approach was essentially a class determination one. That is, that within the womb of feudal Europe, there emerged a kind of merchant class, city-based merchant class. And eventually, while they were able to prosper to some degree within that womb, they and their kind of allies in the towns and countryside experienced the feudal mode of production as a fetter on their aspirations, their productivity, their profitability. And as a result, they broke that fetter through launching a direct political assault, right? And that kind of literature kind of was at its height in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And as I said, you could pick up Christopher Hill's The English Revolution of 1640. You could pick up Lefebvre's multi-volume work on the French Revolution, and you would essentially see this idea of an ascending bourgeois class developing within feudalism, eventually finding the feudal mode of production to be a fetter on its development, and then breaking through that fetter by launching a political revolution. And this gentleman, or sorry, Andrew, I think you said his name was, seemed to be suggesting that the English Revolution of the 17th century was precisely that, right? That the Puritans themselves were kind of yeoman farmers and artisans and merchants who were developing, commercial prosperity, but then they found that there were certain limits placed on them by the feudal aristocracy and their ally in the absolute monarchy, and they wanted to break through it, and that was the revolution. That is a heavily Stalinist Marxist understanding of the bourgeois revolution. What I was trying to get at, and Marx and Engels never wrote directly on the bourgeois revolution as an idea, meaning they use it here and there, and it appears in their writing, obviously. But nevertheless, they're drawing on a whole liberal and German idealist and Enlightenment, French, Scottish, English Enlightenment understanding of the bourgeois revolution, which was a much, much broader transformation of society and the kind of categories and concepts by which people interacted and exchanged with one another, right? Categories and concepts of plausibility that made social life and interaction plausible. And the concept was that the social life itself had profoundly and radically transformed from medieval to early modern Europe. And that transformation was not simply the movement from one mode of production to another, but it actually was a completely unprecedented form of society emerged, really society as such, right? Because under feudalism, there are really different orders of society, right? People are born into different, distinct, separate categories of society with their own customs, rules, and regulations. With bourgeois society, there's the idea that there's really one society, that really the thing that most fundamentally grounds human life, that organizes human communities, is simply social cooperation itself, society as such, and that everybody can be involved in that freely, and that should be the basis for human communities. That really is not only a new practice, but obviously a new idea with the development of bourgeois society in the early modern era. And so what I was trying to get at there was, when I said it was Stalinist, I didn't mean that he was self-consciously Stalinist. My assumption is he would probably be a progressive liberal, some kind of, liberal Democrat voter. I don't know, right? I'm not so certain. Maybe not so much, what was the old term? The beehive, the K-hive, Kamala Harris.
Okay. Maybe not part of the K-hive. Maybe more of a Sanders supporter.
Bernie bro instead of
Bernie bro. Yeah, right.
K-hive.
Maybe.
Yes, exactly. Who knows? Maybe he is a K-hive enthusiast. Who knows? But nevertheless, it seemed that his understanding was deeply shaped by this Stalinist historiography, which also is a progressive historiography. I mean, progressivism also integrates this right into the historiography. And you can, there's a kind of, if you forgive me, a historiographic popular front between a kind of Stalinist Marxist historiography, liberal progressive historiography coming out of not only the Woodrow Wilson era, but the New Deal Great Society era, and even a new left historiography, right? The new left comes in and says, you shouldn't just be class and economically reductionist. You should also introduce categories like settler colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, cisgenderism, etc. Right? You can just add these on, so on and so forth. And there's a kind of pop front from the older Stalinists and progressives to more recent progressives and new leftists, and their broad view is precisely one in which a genuine social emancipation had not taken place, right? But rather a much more limited phenomena taken place where certain category, group, however you want to classify it, a merchant class, white settlers, whatever term you want to use, had essentially, right, created bourgeois radicalism or liberalism as a way essentially to advance their own interests against an older dominant class or order.
I have one last question for you. I know we probably should wrap it up here, but this question of class and the way you're talking about it, and the accusation that the Stalinists were class reductionists rings a lot of bells in my head, because I spent the last decade trying to get the left to reconsider class and the working class as a potential revolutionary subject, and and the political economy and the contradictions within capitalism being more significant than a lot of the ways in which the political struggles appear, and so, and I even made a video at one point saying, we should be class reductionists or something like that, something cheeky or trollish like that. And I just wanted to see if I can restate your position, which is that it's not so much that class, in terms of like the dominance of free labor, isn't the most significant aspect of our contemporary modern life, which is the form of freedom that dominates capitalist society. It's not that that isn't the case, but when we think strictly in terms of class interests, we lose the fact that both the workers, the laborers, and the capitalists are operating as free bourgeois subjects, and that we. This is how I'm thinking about what you said. Tell me if I'm getting it wrong, and that by not recognizing how that subjectivity, that form of freedom, that way of life is in contradiction with itself, we risk simply aligning ourselves with, let's say, a trade union level of political struggle rather than seeking as socialists to go beyond this bourgeois form of life. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, broadly, I think that's right. And do we have time? Could I add something to
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Add to that. Yeah.
Stalinism in many respects is the birth of identity politics, right? I know today with the neo-Stalinists, I'm not familiar with all of them, but I've been exposed through the internet and other activities to enough neo-Stalinism to know that neo-Stalinism presents itself as the kind of great enemy of identity politics and the assertion of class against identity politics. But already Stalinism was premised on the idea of class as really a kind of form of identity, a form of, lived experience that should be embraced, right? For Marx, the development of a proletariat, the proletarianization of society, the creation of this kind of industrial working class of the 19th century is symptomatic of the fact that a new form of social unfreedom has developed. That is, that bourgeois society has gone into contradiction with itself and is in crisis, right? And one of the ways this is manifested is a proletarianized working class, meaning an utterly replaceable, dispensable, disposable working class, all of whom are going to be clamoring for jobs, right? All of whom are going to be sources of cheap labor for capitalists to use and mobilize in production. But that being said, the Marxist point, or the point of Marx and Engels, was to think about a movement, right, centered around that working class that would abolish a world in which that working class continued to exist. And what happens under Stalinism, and Stalinism I'm using obviously as an incredibly broad world historic category, and all I really mean by it are not the specific policies or views of Stalin and his apparatchiks in the Soviet Union. I mean literally the kind of worldview that is the dominant view on the left once you have the defeat of world revolution during the 1920s and the settling into place counter-revolution, right? And of course, Stalinism famously calls defeat a victory. And anybody who thinks what was going on in the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s, or going on in the Eastern Europe after the Second World War during the Cold War was a kind of march of victory, I broadly mean that as a kind of Stalinist imagination, right? And Stalinists came to understand proletarian working class as, a specific social experience. You had to go and capture it by, going and doing anthropological studies, and you had to have artists who produced proletarian art and wrote proletarian literature, and you had to experience their life world and portray it in art and movies and film and whatnot. And eventually you had to get all these evil bourgeoisie capitalists and kulaks and wealthy farmers and peasants. All of these people eventually, had to become proletarianized, right? All of that kind of created class, not as a pathology of capitalist modernity, but as a positive identity of capitalist modernity to be embraced. And no, that is really a problem. And of course, so it's this Stalinist transformation of class from a pathology of capitalist modernity into a fundamental identity of capitalist modernity that then becomes the basis, to proliferate endless identities of marginalized, exploited, oppressed peoples of one form or another, right? Eventually you get into the world of, right, well, so-and-so may be poor, but they're, able-bodied and cisgendered, so they're higher here on a hierarchy and they're exploitive of this person. You just are going to enter into that whole world, right?
Right. One last comment, and then we will wrap it up. But I am at Sublation. I view my task as being the part of the campaign that might be self-reflective, that might be a little more ideological, that does intellectual work mostly. And so I've started this research project in a writing workshop to get leftists to go out into the world, reconnect with real life. It's part of the trend of like overcoming the pandemic. Like, let's meet each other in real life instead of behind screens, that kind of thing. But also to map out working class life in Portland was my first idea, so that we can touch grass, figure out what's actually happening. And I thought of it finally as like a way to relearn of the realist tradition as socialists, right? So now there's a whole bunch of stuff that gets stacked on top of the way that gets framed in people's mind. It's like, all right, so I'm reinventing socialist realism. I'm going to the workers to try to proletarianize them and bring them into socialism to recruit them. I'm trying to create a literature of the working class. Like, these are all ideas that immediately spring up when I make this suggestion, and they're actually the opposite for the most part of what I intend to do with the project. And so my solution is to try to say, no, we're trying to reach people as individuals, help them develop their skills and figure out what they want in society and become part of their lives, and as socialists, through civil society organizing. I feel like it's like a baby step, but do you feel like I can avoid the trap of Stalinism in this manner, or?
I did. Right. No, I think that, I don't think we have a roadmap. I think that's what's so utterly difficult. I don't have answers, meaning I don't have a roadmap, but I think that we can only develop one, at least by reflecting on what we're doing. Right. I mean, we have to try to do things and in an open and generous, but nevertheless critical spirit, reflects upon what we're doing. Mm-hmm. Right. That's why we need, not just civil social organizing, but maximum, freedom of speech and thought. Right. It's not just about being opposed to wokery or cancel culture. It's about being able to allow people to speak their mind, reflecting upon our practice to try and change the world, and to make criticisms of what's going on, to open up new opportunities for different developments. So I just think, though, that there's no roadmap. That's why we're in such a. I mean, that's both in some sense liberating, but it also is incredibly inhibiting. Right? We don't have a roadmap. We don't have a ready guide to start any of this. I think. I don't think we have a ready guide to start any of it. But I also don't think we can kind of, like the utopian socialist of old, sort of draw that roadmap up, absent actually trying to do things and reflect on our practices. Right.
We're going to just have to make mistakes.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to have to make mistakes. And don't get me wrong, when I say that, talk about the working class, I do think we have to appeal to people precisely as you said, as, bourgeois subjects and free laborers. That is, people who just want the ability to determine the course of their own lives. They want to make enough money that they're not dependent on anybody. They're not dependent on the state. They're not dependent on a boss, right? They want to be able to set the course of their own lives. They are willing to work and do something and contribute to society, and they want to get back a fair amount by which they could live their lives. And they don't want to have to be servile or deferential to the state or any bosses to do any of that. So I do think we have to, appeal to people, in that everyday consciousness of bourgeois society as free laborers, simply want to set the course of their own existence, work for who they want to, live where they want to, love who they want to, that kind of thing. We absolutely have to appeal to that. That's the beginning of everything. I just think there's no possibility, you can't begin without appealing to those things and interacting with those things. But on the other hand, I don't have a roadmap, meaning I'm not beyond that basic insight that any kind of serious left movement or proletarian socialist movement has to be rooted in the sensibilities that people have in everyday life in bourgeois society, to be freely self-determining laborers setting the course of their own existence. Beyond that, I don't have the first clue about what's next outside of doing things and reflecting and discussing, debating on those things we've done.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it here. I'm going to play the Star Spangled Banner again on the way out. My task with this, by the way, is to propagandize the left. If I can get people to watch this particular version of the Star Spangled Banner and see the great beauty in it, then I feel like I'm halfway there to the revolution. So I'm going to get that started here. Here it is, Star Spangled Banner.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose stripes and bright stars through the